All right, welcome
Recording
back
in progress.
For day 2 of this board meeting, and seeing that the board members are present, Brooks, will you please call the roll to establish the quorum?
Good morning, Member Banaka.
Here.
Member Burr.
Here.
President Darling Hammond.
Here.
Member Escobedo.
Here.
Member Glover Woods.
Here.
Member McQuillan.
Here.
Member Patillo Brownson.
Here.
Member Rodriguez.
Here.
Member Rucker.
Here.
Vice President Strauss.
Here.
Member Sun.
Here.
Everyone's present. We have a quorum. Thank you.
All right, we'll start by just announcing that in closed session, the board discussed or took action on the following legal matters: EE et al. Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund versus State and related U.S. Department of Justice complaint and Office of Administrative Hearings complaints, and Californians for Equal Rights Foundation et al. Versus State. As we get ready for the work of the day, I want to remind the members of the public who are wishing to dial in for public comment that they should view the live stream of the meeting to know at what time we'll ask for public comment on each item on the agenda. Public comment may be provided by dialing the phone number and participant access code and then following each of the operator's prompts. Upon dialing in, callers will be added to a caller queue. The operator will notify callers when it's their turn to provide public comment, and will also ask the public calling in for public comment to please turn down the speaker volume of their computers if you're following the live feed to avoid an echoing effect. The public comment is limited to 1 minute per speaker per item. And board members, please mute your microphones when not speaking. Keep your cameras on as much as possible to ensure that we maintain a quorum throughout today's virtual meeting. For each item on the agenda, there will be an opportunity for you to raise your hand using the Zoom participant window if you would like to ask a question or make a comment. And we're going to start the day with item 17, which is the California Community Schools Partnership Program Proposed Application Process and Administration Plan. And the CDE recommends that the California State Board approve the Partnership Program Proposed Application Process and Administration Plan. Before I turn it over to my department colleagues, I'd just like to express my excitement about this item. We've begun to see already that community schools can truly be a reconception of how we see and partner with and serve students and their families. They can embody the whole child approach to education as they require collaborative partnerships between education, health and social services, community-based partners to provide integrated health and mental health and social services alongside high-quality supportive education. The size of this year's budget, close to $3 billion, can mean transformative change to the way we serve our highest need schools, particularly those serving 80% or more of our highest need students. And I just want to be sure that as we work on this agenda together, that as every school is on its way to becoming a community school, our goal here is to meet schools where they're at and provide support over the full 7 years of this program to help students, families, and educators recover from the impact of the pandemic, to address longstanding inequalities, and also to transform schools so that every aspect of the school is supportive to students in the classroom, in the hallways, in all of the parts of the school, as well as in the services that may wrap around students. As we have a lot of other programs coming down the pike, mental health funding, funding for before and after school, funding for TK. One of the things we want to help schools do is integrate those services in a productive way to get the maximum benefit of this support for their students and families. So the item will be presented by Lisa Borrego, Pete Callis, Steve Zimmer, and Deanna Niebuhr of the CDE. Dr. Daniel Lee will be available for questions, and we're going to start with an introduction from our state superintendent. Tony, take it away.
Thank you, Darling Hammond, Dr. Darling Hammond, and good morning to you, President Darling Hammond, and to Vice President Strauss, and to the members of the board. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to add just a few framing remarks about the California Schools Partnership Program. I can tell you that there is incredible interest all across the state in this community schools grant. And I want to thank the board liaisons who have participated in robust and spirited conversation about how to create this wonderful opportunity and to implement it. Thank you, Dr. Darling-Hammond, and thank you, Dr. Escobedo, in your roles as board liaisons. I wanted to, as Dr. Darling-Hammond said, this is about just under $3 billion of what many call wraparound supports, health, mental health, social services, to recognize that students, dealing in the pandemic, that there is trauma that needs to be addressed, but also recognizing that even before the pandemic, we used community schools to assist students. When a student is hungry, they're experiencing a toothache, they have a counseling need, they can still learn, but these things become barriers to their learning. Community schools provides a way to help address the wraparound support needs that will ultimately, once they are addressed, support student learning. But community schools are more than just wraparound supports. As Dr. Darling-Hammond noted, they provide transformative solutions for addressing systemic racism, for addressing the impacts of poverty, for helping to create a culture and a climate at schools that moves away from the school to prison pipeline, that moves away from criminalizing children. And when you link this strategy with things like universal meals, universal TK, the kinds of professional development and recruitment that we have for teachers and diversifying our teacher force and our staff at schools, we are facing a wonderful moment of creating transformation for California schools, for addressing the needs for mental health and social emotional learning, for addressing needs to close learning gaps, and for, again, creating transformative communities. I want to share with you that today I'm coming to you from Betty Reed Soskin Middle School. Betty Reed Soskin is America's oldest park ranger. She is 100 years old. She lives and works in the city of Richmond. We had the opportunity to do a ribbon cutting and renaming ceremony for her that she attended this year. And she is an incredible role model for our students about the importance of education. She's been someone that we've been able to name as a spokesperson for California schools and California education. This school also has a wonderful community schools program led by the incredible community schools coordinator, Miss Mitchell, or Miss Kenitra, as the students call her, and the principal, Guthrie Fleischman, under the leadership of the superintendent of West Contra Costa Unified School District, Dr. Hurst, a fabulous district with a fabulous board. And to share, it's the place where I first learned the words community schools many, many years ago. And I had the honor as a former school board member in this district to be able to help to pass a resolution that said we'd have community schools, we'd become a full service community schools district. Dr. Darling-Hammond will remember that lots of times districts would say those words, but they didn't always have the resources to really become a full service community school district. And now we do. Item 17 will do that, and our staff will talk about the kinds of investments that will come for our students. And I have to say that while the state is currently implementing its first round of community schools grants, it was schools like Betty Reed Soskin and schools in San Francisco Unified School District where we got help to design what we're implementing now. And we will continue to do that. In short order, I'll be naming a kind of steering committee or advisory council that will inform the entire process about community schools. This council won't make decisions about who gets a grant, but it will help us to think through all kinds of things like, when we say community schools, what do we really mean? How do we create a framework that is broad for what schools can think about when they think about a community school and what a community school will do? Today, you will hear the elements of the grant program and how we intend to implement it and the timeline that will come with that. That will include many key components, such as technical assistance to schools that would like to have a community schools program, and technical assistance to those that already do have a community schools program. And so we invite you to share your thoughts about how we can improve and enhance the plan. We look forward to whatever direction and guidance that you provide. You will hear from excellent staff who are versed, deeply versed in the community schools movement. like Lisa Borrego, who you know as our Director of Family Engagement at the Department of Education, who's worked on community schools and similar programs in her time in working directly in school districts. You'll hear from Dr. Daniel Lee, who oversees the entire effort. You'll hear from Pete Callis from our College and Career Transitions Division, who will talk to you about some of the nuts and bolts of this grant rollout. He'll also talk to you about some highlights from the current grant. He can talk to you about the evaluation that is to take place of the current initiative. He can answer any questions that you have. And then there's some folks I want to reintroduce you to who you've probably met or heard about, who've joined us through the CDE Foundation. And I want to thank folks like Aaron Hidon and Susan Harvey, who were previously with the Bechtel Foundation, who've really given us resources to bring on some additional staff partners to help in coordination of this strategy. You'll hear from Steve Zimmer, who's joined us in a role as Deputy Superintendent, who himself has worked on community schools during his time serving as a former school board member for Los Angeles Unified School District and as a former teacher and counselor. You'll hear from Diana Niebuhr, someone who's considered an expert on community schools, who's worked on community schools for many, many years, and we're honored that she is now part of our team to work on this. I also just want to say a word of thanks to the entire Department of Education team and the entire State Board of Education team, who have literally been meeting weekly, sometimes daily, to synchronize, to think through, to dream and plan. And it is that collaboration that has helped to create the materials that are before you today for the California Community Schools Partnership Program. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our community schools team to take you through the elements of this proposal. Thank you.
Awesome.
Well, good morning, State Board President Darling Hammond, Vice President Strauss, State Board members, Superintendent Thurman, and Chief Deputy Nicely. Again, my name is Lisa Borrego, and I am the Director of Family Engagement for the California Department of Education. I stand before you as a practitioner who was recently in the field less than a year ago. And as I reviewed the Community School Board item that is being presented to you today, I was excited about what this opportunity means for students, schools, families, and communities all throughout California. I am particularly excited to see family and community engagement as a cornerstone of this work, because what we've learned through the pandemic and have always known is partnership matters. Engaging with and learning from one another is an important part of community schools. I imagine a rural school district seeing this opportunity and thinking they can begin the planning process to bring their community together, talk about what they need, and build a plan to transform their school. I visualize school districts who already have community schools thinking about how this investment can help them continue the work, building bridges and strengthening partnerships between schools, programs, and organizations to provide what students, families, and communities need. It is their voices that breathe life into the hopes and dreams of an educational system that transforms a child's experience, one community at a time. This is what community schools has an opportunity to do for our California's children. Today, our presentation is going to cover the application process, specifically the application process and administration plan, the community engagement plan, as well as the ongoing communication that will take place with the board. And with that, I would like to introduce Pete Callis.
Thank you, Lisa. Good morning, President Darling Hammond, State Board members, Superintendent Thurman, and Chief Deputy Nicely. I'm Pete Callis, Division Director over the Career and College Transition Division. I'm here to present the California Community Schools Partnership Program Application and Administration Plan. CDE recommends approval of the California Community Schools Partnership Program proposed application process and administration plan. The California Community Schools Initiative was kicked off in 2020 when CDE received $45 million in federal funding to administer the California Community Schools Partnership Program for existing California community schools. Then, the expansion of the California Community Schools Program continued when CDE received over $2.8 billion in the 2021-22 state budget to expand on the California Community Schools Partnership Program for new and existing community schools. There is an additional $165 million in state funding allocated for Community Schools Initiative. CD is awaiting direction on the spending authority of these funds right now. The 2020 California Community Schools Partnership Program, RFA, was published in October of 2020. CDE received 102 applications. 20 LEAs were funded to support over 150 California community schools. CDE also contracted with West Ed to provide technical assistance and to develop a legislative report that is due in 2025. The 2021 California Community Schools Partnership Program funding will have multiple rounds of requests for applications for the 3 different types of grants and 1 round for regional technical assistance centers contracts. The overarching goal of the planning and implementation grants is to create the sustainability of the community school program after these grant funds have been exhausted. The RFA will be for planning grants up to $200,000 each of one-time funds. Implementation grants are up to $500,000, and based on conversations with legislative staff and the Department of Finance, there is a common understanding that this level of funding was intended to establish an annual maximum per school site when calculating implementation grants for the LEAs. Coordination grants of up to $100,000 annually are to coordinate sustainability of community school programs. And finally, Regional Technical Assistance Center contracts, RFAs, we will have a minimum of 5 awarded across the state. The application process and administration plan. Community input, visioning, and feedback processes beginning in the fall of 2021, which will inform the California Community Schools Framework. CDE will host outreach and information sessions such as webinars for potential applicants beginning in late fall of 2021. There will be 4 separate RFAs, 1 for each of the funding opportunities. The California Community Schools Partnership Program Application Administration Plan schedule is as follows. Fall of 21 through winter 2021-22, community forums and community input and feedback sessions will take place. RFAs will be published for winter 2021-22 for regional technical assistance centers. Their contracts will be processed in the fall of 2022. The first round of planning grant RFAs will be out in early spring of 2022, and they will be funded late spring of 2022. Implementation grant first round RFAs will be out in early spring and will also be funded in late spring of 2022. Funding for planning and implementation grants will be awarded in time for LEAs to incorporate into their 2022-23 budgets. Coordination grants will come later in the administration plan, with round 1 being in 2024-25. As described previously, planning grants will be funded on a competitive basis at the LEA level to qualifying entities for up to 2 years. The implementation grants will be funded over multiple rounds. Per statute, CDE must set aside funds for planning grantees to receive a subsequent implementation grant for at least a 5-year period. And finally, coordination grants are meant to help grantees step down from the support of the grant funds. They're scheduled to be released later in the 7-year program period. Now to eligibility, grant eligibility. The eligibility requirements are the same for all 3 grant opportunities. The detailed grant eligibility requirements are on page 11 of Board Item 17. The main eligibility requirement threshold is that at least 50% of enrolled pupils are unduplicated at the LEA level. While LEAs will be the ultimate recipients, other eligible applicants include a consortium of schools. A single school that satisfies the minimum thresholds for LEAs can make an LEA eligible, along with county and governmental agencies that will operate the community schools program in partnership with at least one LEA that is a qualifying entity. The competitive priorities for the grant opportunities include there are multiple competitive priorities that are the same for all three of the grant opportunities. The competitive priorities details can be found on pages 12 and 13 of Board Item 17. One of the main competitive priorities is that at least 80% of the student population at schools in an LEA are eligible for free and reduced priced meals. Accountability measures for the community schools program include student level measures, including student and family engagement levels. There are also program level measures, which is the establishment and the expansion of their community partnerships. Per statute, all grant recipients must commit to providing data as specified by CDE and participate in the overall program evaluation, which will support CDE reporting in 2025 and 2027. There are more details on the accountability measures on page 13 of Board Item number 17. For the regional technical assistance centers, CDE must fund a minimum of 5 of the, as we call them, RTAC center contracts. The awardees will be funded on a competitive basis. Regional technical assistance centers will be contracted for 7 years and required to be renewed annually. Regional technical assistance centers will assist successfully funded planning grantees and implementation grantees with all of their community school activities, including but not limited to conducting a comprehensive needs and asset assessment, creating their community partnerships, creating funding sources for sustainability of their community school programs, which will include braided funding opportunities that are at LEAs currently. The eligibility requirements for the regional technical assistance centers include they must have an existing community schools department or office, the capacity to provide technical assistance to the planning grantees and implementation grantees, the ability to provide curriculum and professional development, and the capacity to monitor community school grantees, including collecting data and creating the required reports to CDE. For the RTACs, the expected outcomes are similar to their competitive requirements in their RFA. CDE will provide guidance to the RTACs to meet the required outcomes: comprehensive needs and assets assessment, creating community partnerships, and creating funding sources for the sustainability of the programs after grant funds have been exhausted. Included in Board Item 17 is an attachment that provides a visual of the 7-year breakdown of the California Community Schools Partnership Program Administration Plan. So this is an overview of the entire plan that will guide our work in getting the funding out and selecting the grantees for all of the 3 grant opportunities, along with the contracts for the regional technical assistance centers. I would now like to pass the presentation on to my esteemed colleague, Deputy Superintendent Steve Zimmer, to provide information on community engagement for the California Community Schools Partnership Program.
Thank you. Thank you, Pete, and good morning to everyone. I appreciate and honored to have the chance to speak with you about our community engagement process. Our goal as the CDE team is to provide a process and to implement an engagement process that meets and honors really the depth of what the potential transformation could be with this community schools investment. So our purpose in this engagement process is to create a shared framework which supports our aspirations in California for school transformation and really elevates a California model for community schools. We also, through the engagement process, want to build a full understanding of the type of TA that will be needed to really build a technical assistance infrastructure that will assist both districts and schools on the ground for implementation. And finally, we want to make sure that we are creating an application process that is accessible and realistic for small districts and small and rural LEAs, but also throughout the state, recognizing and considering what our schools have been through during the pandemic, the pressures that are on LEAs, and making sure that we're creating a process that really is aligned with the community schools vision. Next slide, please. There are 5 elements to this community engagement process, and within these elements, we're going to use multiple strategies to gather input and feedback, ideas, and aspirations from a broad set of partners. We're going to hold regional forums throughout the state to really make sure we're hearing the voices from across all of the different terrains of public education in the state of California. We're also going to visit school sites and hold listening sessions from the initial pilot schools in the 2020 model that Pete had, the 2020 pilot that Pete referenced. We're going to visit the schools. We're going to hear from students. We're going to hear from families. We're going to hear from community school coordinators, like the community school coordinator in West Contra Costa that Superintendent Thurman referenced. Also hear from educators and practitioners. We are also going to hold listening sessions with the leadership of these LEAs who have experienced the implementation of these pilot grants. We're going to hold, and have already begun to hold, meetings with statewide advocacy groups, groups that represent parents, groups that represent students, civil rights groups, activists and advocates, community school experts, but also groups that represent our labor partners and represent the folks on the ground who will be implementing the plan that we develop. We're also going to make sure that we're meeting with advocacy groups to be fully inclusive. So groups that include our earliest learners, our students with special need, and our multilingual learners. And finally, we know that our best outreach efforts are not necessarily going to reach everyone. So we're going to create time, what we're calling office hours, where we can respond to folks who reach out to CDE through this process, but also have time to set up additional meetings with partners and with folks on the ground across the state who have strong feelings about how we can make our vision for community schools a transformational reality on the ground for students in the state of California. If we could go to the next slide. And I just wanted to expand a little bit on Superintendent's introductory comments. The Superintendent will be appointing an advisory council comprised of constituents. I will include, not necessarily be limited to, advocates, practitioners, educators, students, families, and community members. And Superintendent will also delineate the process for selecting the members, the terms and the scope of the work of this advisory council. And this will be based in part on our engagement process and what we're hearing about best practices. And so we will be updating the board in the spring on both the engagement process and the establishment of this advisory council. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Deanna Nieberg, who will take us through our next steps.
Thank you, Steve. The CDE team
values and acknowledges that ongoing communication with the board will be critical to the successful development and implementation of the California Community Schools Partnership Program. Specifically, some elements that will be covered in updates and ongoing communications include the framework, then also the information sharing and outreach process to encourage grant applications. Considerations here will include outreach that helps all LEAs get started early in planning to apply and also reaches their community partners. Targeted outreach to small and rural LEAs, as Steve mentioned, and targeted outreach to potential co-applicants such as early learning programs. Next, the accessibility of the application process in general and making sure that the application process is doable for LEAs. Also, grant allocations, including considerations of grant size based on school and consortium size and stage of development of the initiatives in the applications. Also, considering the potential adjustments to the overall timeline based on the number of applicants and grants made in the different rounds. Next, the system for accountability, including considerations of both near and long-term student and program outcomes, how accountability measures lend themselves and link to continuous improvement, and what does the map for developmental progress look like? And then how this link between outcome measures and continuous improvement is supported through the technical assistance provided. Finally, the TA system itself, including its content, infrastructure, and function. Considerations in building the TA content will include linking to the other major divisions and work in CDE itself, and connecting to other major initiatives like the build out of the school-based mental health systems through the mental health student services grants. Also, the work to enhance local systems of care for foster youth and others. Finally, looking to sustainability, improvements, and know-how regarding to the school-based Medi-Cal funding streams, as well as Medi-Cal funded mental health programs. This comprehensive TA system will be built out of the broad engagement and input process and ongoing communication between CDE and the board. With that, I'll pass it back to Pete Callis.
Thank you, Deanna. This brings us back to the recommendation for the California Community Schools Partnership Program. The California Department of Education recommends approval of the California Community Schools Partnership Program proposed application process and administration plan, which includes the grant request for application timeline, the Regional Technical Assistance Center request for application timeline and contract eligibility and requirements, along with the broad community engagement and listening process. I'd now like to pass it back to President Darlene Hammond.
Take myself off of mute. Thank you so much. Lots here for us to think about and discuss. We've got the phone line open for public comment. I want to note that members of the public wishing to provide comment may do so by calling the telephone number and using the access code provided on the slide that is shown now. And while we're waiting for members of the public to call in, I want to ask Member Escobedo if he has any initial comments before me.
Yes, what an amazing working group we had. Everyone passionate for this concept of community schools, and definitely we know the urgency of it, right? I mean, we heard it yesterday. One of our students, Alicia, reported that over 30% of our students with trauma have come into our school needing assistance. And, you know, we wish we could apply this yesterday, right? And in many of our school systems, but we want to get this right? So this plan of creating a group to look at create a framework to ensure this is done right. Why? Because we want this to be sustainable over time beyond the 8 years. And we definitely want to maximize the investment we're putting in for the lives of our students. But that's what we're doing. This has, like you heard before, the potential to transform the lives of many of our students and have a direct effect on ensuring that we can maximize the academic potential for every student in California as well. So I look forward to the discussion, to hear the public comments, to be hopefully part of the listening forum in one venue or another, because we want to get this right. And I appreciate also that continual improvement process that we incorporated in this plan, the technical assistance. So again, that integrated approach is crucial, and I know we're going to have probably a construct. We'll create a construct that will be how could I say, what other states will be looking at. We will be a great case study in the future.
Yes, I'll just sort of add on and say, the team at the department has been working intensely on, this very complex process. As you can see, has many components and moving parts, and a great sense of urgency to get the RFAs, out in the early early in the calendar year, so that by the end of the semester, we'll have places knowing that they have planning grants to get going, and in the cases of places that are already up and running with community schools, implementation grants to expand the work that they're doing. So it's a tremendous amount. I'm looking forward to the framework that will come in January at our next meeting. The law is really clear that this is a very holistic approach, that community schools are not just places that add a health clinic on the side, but that they have restorative practices, social and emotional learning and supports, that every aspect of the school is supportive to the students in it. And so we'll need, to really work through a lot of technical assistance and supports for schools to, as Francisco said, to be really in a ongoing continuous improvement framework for transformation of in the lives of the children and the families that they serve. So it's an exciting initiative. The talent that has been brought into the department and the talent that was already in the department coming together in a very active, well-integrated team to do this work is inspiring, I think, and we're grateful to them for all that they've already done and will do. And with that, I think we want to open well, let me see if there are any clarification questions from the board, just clarification questions, because we'll come back for discussion after public comment. And I see a hand up from Member Glover Woods and one from Member Burr. Member Glover Woods.
Good morning again. Would you please, for the CDE staff, clarify the time frame for the selection of the regional, the technical assistance centers, the regional technical assistance centers, and the time frame for the selection of the first round of planning grant recipients?
So our goal is to get the RFAs out in very early spring, late winter, and get through that process as quickly as we can to get the funding out to the planning grantees prior to their planning of their 2022-23 budget. The contracts for the regional technical assistance centers are a little bit different. We can make the selections, but then we have to go through the contracting process that we have built into the state. So it'll take a little bit more time for that. That's why we said probably fall of 2022.
Okay, so just to clarify, the first round of planning grant recipients would know their selection prior to the regional technical assistance centers being identified and established?
It might be identified, but maybe not established.
Right.
Sorry.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Member Burr.
Member Burr, I believe you're on mute.
So articulate too. I'm trying to clarify sort of the overall objective. I want to make sure I'm clear about it over the lifespan of the program. Is it that every school in California would ultimately become a community school? That's question one. And then the second one follows the answer to that one.
I think the intent of the funding, we should say, is to support California's schools that serve student populations with the greatest need. So we're looking that there's sufficient funding to reach all schools with 80% or greater free and reduced price meal or unduplicated counts with grant support. But I think it's important to think of the community schools approach and the TA that will be provided, that we're building the capacity of school districts to behave in these ways. And so at some point, we should be able to support districts to build community school initiatives and add schools to their initiatives, not necessarily with grant support in the future.
Okay, and you sort of touched on my second question. I'm just a little bit confused about the different terms and percentages that are being used. At one point, it talks about 50% unduplicated. And for purposes of our general public, it would be helpful, I think, to clarify what unduplicated means. And secondly, then we talked about 80% or greater high poverty. So how do those two things intersect for purposes of eligibility?
And I think this is partly to going to the question of how the district eligibility is defined and how school eligibility is defined. Deanna?
Yeah, well, so on the eligibility of applicants, it's 50% or greater unduplicated counts. For the LEA itself, that's a floor to become eligible to apply. And then the 80% is an aspirational competitive priority on the school level. So I come in as an LEA to apply and show the schools that I'm applying for, and that's where the 80% comes in, to give me a competitive priority.
Okay, and again, can you, for purposes of folks who don't know what the term unduplicated means, clarify that? What are we talking about?
That's a term from LCFF. Yeah, so it's the low-income students, English learners, foster care, and do we have another one? Homeless is not part of that count. Okay, and it's unduplicated because you don't get counted twice if you're in one of those three categories.
Member McQuillan, you have a clarifying question?
Yes, thank you. And this is so exciting. I appreciate the presentation and this opportunity to help our most vulnerable students throughout the state of California. But my question is, Steve and others have mentioned that rural and remote areas will have access to the application. And but are there any other assurances that our rural districts will, have a fair share of these resources? Thank you.
I think, like we stated before, with outreach and also as we create the details of the application process, we have those rural and small schools in mind. And I think in legislation, it's why you got that 50% number. The year before, 80% was the goal. Was the threshold, and the 50% gets you, gets you a broader applicant pool. So for outreach, but also the application process itself, we have in mind the small and rural school districts, absolutely.
And probably worth mentioning something about the fact that counties are eligible entities also.
Yeah, and that in the rural situation, it can be the County Office of Ed that would be the lead entity that would help with that deep coordination and the administration of the program, and would be a sensible applicant for the grant itself.
I don't see any other clarifying questions being raised at this moment, so we'll go to public comment and then we'll come back for board discussion.
Hello, caller. Please state your name and affiliation for the record. You have 1 minute. Your time begins now.
I'm not sure if I'm the caller for the public comment.
You are the caller.
Good morning. My name is Terry Sapahan. I'm an enrolled member of the group tribe in Northern California and executive director of the True North Organizing Network, a member part and parcel of Pico, California's Ed for Lib and the California Partnership for the Future of Learning. We have worked in a regional community partnership with Mr. Jim Aquila and the Yurok tribe and 15 other community partners to create a Department of Education, U.S. Department of Education Promise Neighborhoods program. We eventually hope to serve public schools throughout Humboldt, Del Norte, and tribal lands. Two comments. One, we are strongly in support of this historic community schools partnership. It is astounding, and that gets to the second part of our concern and our comment, which is time. We've heard many members talk about wanting to get this right, and we encourage you to not set February as the date for adopting your framework. I think we got it in. Thank you.
Hello, caller. Please state your name and affiliation for the record. You have 1 minute. Your time begins now.
Hello, my name is Michael Juba, and I am a classroom teacher representing CTA. CTA recommends that, 1, the Advisory Council be convened immediately to support the CD's efforts from the start. 2, that the CDE addresses the reality of the support gap as the program is starting off. 3, the SBE and CDE work with the legislature and the governor's office to address the limit of $500,000 per qualifying entity. 4, the RFAs provide preference points for the creation of a district steering committee, as well as a dedicated community schools coordinator. And 5, that the CDE focus their TA Center RFA on the 5 technical assistance centers that will partner with the LEAs to ensure that there is appropriate capacity and bandwidth to support the rural areas. Thank you.
Thank you, caller. Hello, caller. Please state your name and affiliation for the record. You have 1 minute. Your time begins now.
Good morning, State Board of Education members. My name is Lorraine Richards, and I'm a classroom teacher representing California Teachers Association. California Teachers Association supports this historic investment of nearly $3 billion for community schools, and we believe that this provides a real opportunity to transform public education for our students and communities. Overall, we believe that CDE's proposed administration plan is sound and will be vital to the rollout of the California Community Schools Partnership Program. CTA provided separate letters on this item. The first one contained a number of recommendations on the administration of the program, and the second was a coalition letter that included 39 CTA chapters and 46 community groups that focused on educator and community engagement to ensure that this investment promotes a deep, sustainable, and community-based model. As previously stated by Michael Juba, he was providing public comment on what the focus of the specific recommendations were. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, caller. Hello, caller. Please state your name and affiliation for the record. You have 1 minute. Your time begins now.
Hi, Erin Apty on behalf of Public Advocates of the California Partnership for the Future of Learning. We support CDE's plan for community engagement to develop a California community schools framework to guide program implementation. The framework will be foundational to the community schools program and inform the RFAs, technical assistance, program roles, and accountability measures, among others. The state needs to model the values and best practices of strong community schools by ensuring there is adequate time to draft the framework in response to meaningful input from the people most impacted by this program: students, families, educators, and community partners working in schools. To authentically reflect input received at the community forums and listening sessions held this fall and winter, the framework cannot reasonably be adopted earlier than February. CDE needs time to do engagement in November and December and synthesize input before drafting. With the year-end holidays, it's unrealistic to expect a framework draft before January. The public should have opportunities to review January drafts and provide additional feedback before the framework is finalized. If it will go before the board, then adoption should happen at the March meeting or a special February one. Rushing framework adoption without providing substantial opportunity for community input would undermine the credibility of the planned engagement process and program implementation.
Thank you, caller.
Thank you.
Hello, caller. Please state your name and affiliation for the record. You have 1 minute. Your time begins now.
My name is Katie Nunez-Adler, and I'm the statewide coordinator for the California Partnership for the Future of Learning. As a partnership, we believe that shared decision-making at the state, district, and school site levels is essential to making the community schools program successful. We support establishing an advisory council at the statewide level. For the council to be meaningful, Black, Indigenous, and other students and families of color and low-income directly impacted folks need to be represented. Additional stakeholders, including educators, labor partners, community-based organizations that partner with schools, advocates, and policy groups and researchers should also be included. We would also like to see minimum requirements developed for districts to establish multi-stakeholder bodies for shared government that include independent representation from low-income, BIPOC, and other directly impacted students and families, along with educators, community partners, and district administrators. District-level bodies would be responsible for developing, maintaining, and monitoring systems, infrastructure, and relationships
Caller,
at the district
your time
level
is up.
to support continuous improvement. Thank you.
Caller. Hello, caller. Please state your name and affiliation for the record. You have 1 minute. Your time begins now.
Hey, I'm Kimner with the California Community Schools Learning Exchange. The CSLX is a consortium of multi-sector practitioners and advocates working to strengthen the community schools field. And although CSLX is new, the deep work of community school partnerships in California is not. Currently, our work seeks to support, lift up, and learn from those experts that have been implementing community school practices for years, whether or not they've been calling them community schools. We're currently working to facilitate a consensus process on implementation standards, initially developed in 2017 in partnership with community school practitioners across California specifically and nationally. And through this transparent and inclusive process, we seek to complement the work of the department to name cultures, systems, and practices that are foundational to effective implementation, and identifying areas where implementation might differ based on local context. We're thrilled to be able to advance this work and look forward to working in partnership with you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, caller. Hello, caller. Please state your name and affiliation for the record. You have 1 minute. Your time begins now. Hello, caller. Please state your name and affiliation for the record. You have 1 minute. Your time begins now.
Good morning. Angelica Honko here with Public Advocates and a member of the California Partnership for the Future of Learning. Most importantly, I'm a public school parent. To quote Melissa, a leader with our California Partnership and a high school sophomore, normal wasn't working for a lot of people, especially students of color. We must work together with decision makers to create a school where we are comfortable and can succeed. I don't want to go back to a classroom. I want to go back to a community. Impacted students and families expect a seat at the table at every stage of this community schools grant process. We appreciate CDE's plan to hold multi-tiered community engagement in the coming months to solicit input and feedback and develop community buy-in. For stakeholder engagement to be meaningful and authentic, it must center the most impacted students, families, and communities. We appreciate the CDE's commitment to community regional forums as a step in this direction. Feedback gathered from these forums and other input sessions should be synthesized and made available to the public prior to adopting the California Community Schools Framework. And community engagement must continue to be part of.
Thank you, caller.
We're so hopeful about the opportunity. Thank you.
This concludes public comment.
Thank you very much. And now we're open for a board discussion. Who would like to kick us off? Vice President Strauss.
So I want to thank the CD team for the presentation. I have a couple areas I'd just like some clarification on. This is a huge project, and I appreciate Member Escobedo's comment that we got to get this right and to take our time so that we develop it. So my first question is about the process of the framework development, the guidance. I understand the framework development will have input, but I'm interested, having been through some framework developments, what the process is, because this will guide the program as I understand it. So again, I have 2 or 3 questions, but that's my first one. The development process for the framework that will guide the implementation, and I assume the granting of the special grants.
Yeah, so for the framework development, it's a major piece of the full and broad community outreach, input, and feedback that we're doing this fall. And a big highlight of that process is 6 regional virtual community forums where we have partners that are building a ground game so that there will be deep participation from those communities to reflect on the community school approach and what those communities see as students, families, and school staff, and community partners, how they see what a transformational approach would be, what their community schools should look like in California. And then layered on top of that will be sessions we've already started input sessions about visioning around community schools where some of the advocates have weighed in. And we'll have those folks look at iterations of that framework as it gets built, including for those community forums, for them to see a version of the input they gave and get to reflect on that input. And then we'll definitely have a broad way for folks to submit thoughts in writing. So
just a question. So, and maybe President Darling-Hammond or Member Escobedo knows, but is this the type of guidance document that will come before the board for final editing before it goes into practice?
I think the idea is that it would come in January. And the challenge is that if we want grants to go out, if it's going to guide grant making, and an RFA needs to be let before, early in the spring or late in the winter for schools to know whether they've gotten these grants, or districts to know whether they've gotten these grants in time to do planning for the following year. January is the optimal time for it to come before the board. If we wait until March, then the whole cycle will mean that we'll miss the beginning of the school year.
So I understand that. I just think...
And it will come to the board.
This is late fall right now. I'll just say that. And we know people will be off Thanksgiving week, and then there's a couple weeks in December. I just think we probably don't have that much time to do a good draft and to be thoughtful about it. And I mean, some of the other board members may have some comments, but I agree we want to get this right. I mean, there are some clear guidance areas for people who have experience in implementing community schools effectively. And I know LPI has done some research on that as well, but I just want to be thoughtful. We really don't have much time to prepare for a January board item. That's my first comment. My second comment is, I believe schools and district staff are stretched at this time. Everyone's really exhausted, teachers and leaders, and there's also a staffing shortage at a time when we would be looking to add coordination and leadership to implement community schools, even in the planning grants. And so I just want to be sensitive to trying to get this right and recognizing the the lack of additional staff and capacity during this year, which turned out to be far more challenging than people expected. And so I just want to raise that point. My final point is, and maybe Steve Zimmer is the one to talk about it, but it's the advisory council. My understanding is the superintendent wants to add an advisory council to guide this. And I'm interested in that role versus the role of the state board and how all the pieces kind of guide this huge, complex process.
Board President would be okay to respond?
Yeah, please.
Okay, thank you.
Please do.
Thank you, Vice President Strauss. And you are raising some of the key balancing issues that we have here with balancing the priority and the urgency of making sure that we can get started with what you eloquently and our callers eloquently have outlined, and Dr. Escobedo outlined in terms of making sure we get this right. So a couple of things. One is that process that ends in January, and it is and we envision a dynamic relationship in terms of our engagement with, specifically with Dr. Darling Hammond and Dr. Escobedo, as we already have in building both today's presentation and our process moving forward, but also anticipate that feedback from the board as a whole is going to be critical, not just at the beginning, but throughout this process. And so that gets me a little bit to the question of the advisory council. So the advisory council, as we've had our initial conversations with the superintendent and some of our interest holders and community partners and education partners throughout the state, is we envision that this group guiding and advising through the implementation phase. So as we begin to see the technical assistance process roll out, as we begin to see the RFA process roll out, we want to get ongoing input from this advisory council to make sure that we are hearing both from practitioners, from experts, and as Dr. Escobedo said, getting this right both in the initial construct, in building the foundation, but throughout the implementation process.
Thanks, Steve.
Do you want to speak to, just to go back to the second question that Vice President Strauss raised about the current context, the thinking about
yes,
the way in which grants will be given for planning grants, for example, where I'll just note most of the work goes on after you get the planning grant, so you don't have to have a lot of capacity on the front end. Planning grant allows you to have capacity, but I know you're balancing that too, the question of how to make grants accessible.
Yeah, thank you for elevating that. And we're acutely aware of the stress upon LEAs right now, and want to make sure that we are very intentional about the equity goals of this legislation, and really that kind of guides the heart and soul of the community schools movement. And we want to make sure that the students, families, the school communities that have faced the most persistent disparities have access to these grants and this kind of transformational process. But we also want to be very aware that we don't want to create an additional stressor or burden right now on districts, on LEAs. We want to make sure that particularly the planning grant, but also the parallel process for districts who want to expand, that is accessible, that the initial RFAs are not burdensome with unnecessary paperwork, and we don't need, with all due respect to all the doctors on the board, we don't need doctoral thesis in terms of in terms of these applications. We need to see the intent, the goal, the commitment to transformation and equity through this process. And so that's what's really driving our thinking right now.
I want to know that you've talked a lot about how to make the application process a smooth one.
Smooth one and user-friendly.
Right. I see Member Sun, Member Rucker, and Member Glover Woods. Member Sun?
Thank you. So yeah, I'm excited about the vision of these community schools. But my questions and comments are related to Member Strout as well around the implementation and how this particular initiative fits into our larger system, so that we ensure that while we're adding new initiatives and more money into the pot, if you will, and targeted to similar schools, we want to target this money to students and to districts that most need the support. So how does this fit into, let's say, the LCAP process, the system of support that we're building through the collaborative? We already have technical assistance centers as part of that system of support. So where does the tech assistance centers for this fit into that bigger picture? I feel that we kind of recreate the wheel for every one of these projects that we add, and in different pots of funding and accounting for those pots of funding and writing the plans that are very similar to plans and to feedback that they've already gotten from educational partners in the LCAP process. So, you know, I think somehow in the implementation of how this it's got to spread to some of the system that we currently have. And then also wanted to speak to the point that Member Straw brought up around capacity right now in our system. And with the lack of staffing that's happening right now, schools are having a hard time even just spending the money that they have that are coming in from both the state and the federal level to implement programs. So how will this fit into it? And then when there is the reporting of the funds for how this initiative through the community schools is funds that are being spent on the implementation and planning of this, how does that fit with other funding that the district or schools may be receiving for similar students?
Yes. Okay. So maybe to start, think about the community schools effort as a way, a second chance or another way to emphasize meeting the goals of LCFF, the priorities and goals of LCFF. But then to seriously answer your question, looking to the TA. So as we build out that TA infrastructure, the content would focus on how to support these kinds of planning processes and do alignment for your multiple planning processes. Community schools is not meant to be a sidebar or another effort. It should be the central effort and include LCFF and not be duplicative. And then also around the TA, we definitely, in building that infrastructure, have our eye to looking at those other systems for providing TA around school improvement and making sure that when we build this infrastructure, we're learning from those systems, lessons learned, but also have an eye to, ultimately, community schools should be the way that schools function in California. So we have that we're thinking about those considerations are being made as we build the TA system. And then I think you also asked about the staffing issues, and And I just want to reiterate that the CDE team is very keenly aware of how much assistance school districts need now in juggling these funding streams, dealing with the staffing issues and all of that. So also thinking about the TA that can be provided, building on the TA that's already being provided to our first round of grantees, how can we get some help out ahead of building this formal infrastructure?
Yeah.
Could I add a comment about this question about staffing? You know what, I think a goal that the department staff have talked a lot about is that a community school approach at the district level and the school level adds staff whose job it is to coordinate all those other funds and services. So it's not another program added on like another categorical. It's a way to manage that complexity that already exists rather than, you know, adding yet another kind of set of, you know, obligations. So anyway, it should be helpful in that goal if it works well, and is in the places where it works well. The question is going to be how to help people learn to do it.
Yeah, and I completely agree that, and I see it absolutely in the presentation. And we haven't really said how this particular initiative fits into the larger system. So I think that's part of the communication of this is how this fits into our ultimate goal as a state and how we're doing it the California way, which we, you know, discussed. So for the last 4 years or so. So that's really more what my point is to how do we frame it into the larger system.
If I could, through the chair, Board Member Sun, I'd like to pick up where Dr. Darling Hammond left off. The community schools coordinator is a central component to how the connection to all these wonderful services and supports will happen. There's really no way to do this without having a community schools coordinator, and sometimes more. But I appreciate your question. I do think that we have to be thoughtful about how all these resources get implemented, and they cannot be viewed as in isolation. And I don't think anyone on this board or this staff of these agencies does, but it is a tremendous opportunity. If we think about community schools and how it aligns with universal TK and universal meals and the $4.3 billion for mental health that is in the budget, we're constantly thinking, how do we align all of these efforts? And we will make maximum impact and at the same time figure out how to help our field, which is dealing with, as you said, massive staffing and capacity challenges. We know that we have to, for example, we have to work with our field, and we've begun these conversations to figure out how to create more mental health clinicians who can work in many parts of our state, including in our rural communities. And so these staffing challenges have to be addressed, but we are looking at how to align all these resources in tandem, not separately. And I think we can create the kind of impacts that you're alluding to, and certainly keep in mind our existing frameworks that we use, like LCAP and the systems of support. Ultimately, I believe that when we talk about the social economics that are going to impact many of those who are selected for these grants, they are the same communities where we're looking at for the wonderful resources provided through LCFF and places where the systems of support is available to help support achievement. And so we have to overlay them and align them. And we're happy to work with any of the members of the board and anyone else in how we maximize that alignment and overlaying.
Thank you very much. I have a lot of folks eager to get some ideas on the table. So I want to go to Member Rucker, then Member Glover Woods, then Member Rodriguez, and then Member Burke. Member Rucker.
Thank you very much. First of all, I do want to thank the staff for clearly what was a great deal of work in preparing for today's presentation. This is a large and significant and important investment. This is a large, significant, and important opportunity. And the adjective that I kept hearing was excited. And the noun excitement kept coming up in the discussion. And great anticipation is what was laid in front of me in looking forward to this particular item today. But I have to tell you, as I listened to the presentation, the word that came into my mind was awesome. Now, for some people, awesome has this meaning that's more, okay, you're about to understand why I'm an English major, so if your eyes roll over, that's okay. But for a lot of people, when you hear that word awesome, you think about how the adverb really talks about extremely well or extreme or excellently, that things are going so well. I'm thinking about the adjective, and this awesome is one of those words that carries dual meaning at the same time. It's both impressive but daunting. It's both inspiring, great admiration, but at the same time, apprehension and fear. And so for the community partners and the community of people who need to be involved in implementing this community schools program, awesome is a very good adjective to use. The department's excitement and clear, impressive anticipation about the good that this program will do is evident. But what you've heard both from stakeholders and from some of my colleagues on the board is you have another set of community partners who have a different set of concerns at this moment. They may be excited, but they're also overwhelmed. They're also having some apprehension about what this work would be. One of the things I was hoping to hear, while it's very evident that you have done a lot of planning and it's very clear that you have the ability to do some multitasking, your charge today was to do some table setting, to help everyone understand what it means to come to this process and what they can bring to the table, but also, the differences between the planning phase and the full implementation phase. As our board president made clear, applying for the planning grant actually gives you the opportunity to create the capacities that we are all afraid right now don't exist in the schools that this program is intended to be for. And so I think as part of the table setting, as we move forward from this conversation we had today to the conversations that have to continue at the LEA and the county level, is there needs to be more attention paid in that presentation to the table setting, what it means to begin, putting an emphasis on existing structures, putting an emphasis and giving a clear explanation in the guidance that's to come on what will be built up or what will be developed as the process unfolds. And while we can sit here at this level, we understand that we're at the beginning stages and there's an architecture that has to be built out and developed. And that's the natural outgrowth from creating the guidance and all the things that are coming down the road. That's not what's really clear or laid out to the LEAs and the leadership that need to do these applications and do this support. And so I think that as you do this, I'd like to think of today's presentation as the rough draft. And as you hone out some of the rough edges from today's presentation, you focus on that to the table setting interest for the groups that you're charging to do the application and to get into this process and to start a different relationship with you. I think I disagree with the idea that this is not an additional program or an add-on, because that's the way I heard it today. That's the way it was received. The reason I say I heard it that way and I received it that way is I wasn't really clear on how the other divisions in the department are going to be contributing to or even are part of the frame or the architecture of this program. The example that was given was concerning the LCAP. Since the LCAP and the work that schools do is going to be a central part of the planning and the instructional functions of this community school, I don't see how any of that was considered or brought in. We have technical assistance centers already in place. Are these, and the way this was presented, this is going to be a new system of support and a new system of technical assistance centers. And I don't believe that was the intent of the presentation, but that's the way it was received, as if this is going to be a new and different entity for technical assistance. So I think we have to be more mindful in setting the table on implementing this very broad, very important program of thinking about what the relationship is. Is there an umbrella that brings the LCFF and all the other school functions into the work of what's happening with the community schools? So which is the umbrella, the community schools or the LCFF? For schools that are considered high priority schools and they have that separate label, is that the umbrella? I think the relationship among all the activities that are happening with the intent of benefiting high need, high priority schools and the students they serve there needs to be some clarification about the architecture of all of this work, because that really wasn't as well laid out as it could be. Because we do this planning and we understand this planning all the time, we know the difference between the planning phase and what the planning grant is supposed to do and the full implementation phase. But that wasn't as really well laid out, I don't think, as it could be. So I'm very pleased at the work that was done. It's evident that you are the beneficiaries of a lot of planning and a lot of interaction, but I'm not really sure that the scope and the full force of the department and the roles of the other divisions in the department are made clear, and the functions of the programs that are already in place at the school site, district, and county level are clearly indicated in the architecture and the full implementation of this. And you know, I'm very happy as a thinker and looking at all those broad avenues. I'm very happy to be a critical friend on looking at those things, but those were just the pieces that were left out. And then finally, as I said yesterday, we're really good on the planning, but we have a really hard time talking about accountability. You know, the point was made that the work we're already doing is raising test scores. So yeah, I will agree, a high tide raises all boats, but there has got to be a clear understanding that the intent is not just to raise or improve student achievement, but to raise and create avenues for students to catch up and keep up. And that wasn't as well laid out today for the purpose and the goal for creating these community schools. That wasn't as well laid out as it could have been either. So planning was great, but again, the conversation on accountability and monitoring as we go through this wasn't as well explained as it could have been. So I will leave it there.
Thank you. We have a lot of folks who want to get in, but I do want to see if anyone in the department wants to call up any of the points that were made in the memo that the board received prior to the meeting, which did deal with some of the accountability questions and some of the other points.
If I could,
Linda, that's the reason why I'm making my point. We got the memo and I read that, but there was a difference between what I read, what I received and was explained to me, and what was made public here. People are going to remember what was made public here.
Right. That's why I'm giving folks a chance to raise those points so that the public that's trying to listen in. But I do want to also get to our other board members. So, but I want to give the department staff, if they want to, that opportunity.
Darling Hammond, I want to address, because I do agree with some of the points and concerns that came up from Vice President Strauss, also from Board Member Sun and Board Member Rucker. But I want to sort of address them in a couple of different ways. I think one thing that wasn't really sort of clarified, I think, in the presentation is that this is an iterative process, that we're going to start with sort of some foundational points. And then the goal is, particularly through sort of community partnership engagement, the evolution of the advisory council, and feedback from the field, that we're going to develop. We're not expecting to accomplish everything in year one. We know that in this process, we have schools who are going to make decisions about what's the best timing for them to join in. So that's one of the reasons there's multiple rounds for implementation as well as planning grants. So people can pick and choose when they have the capacity to participate in this initiative. The other point that I really want to highlight, and I think Board Member Rucker really brought this up, and also Board Member Sun, was how does all of this sort of center? I guess the conversations that we've been having with sort of community partners is that community schools, like the framework, the model, however way you want to sort of describe it, becomes the point of focus. So to Board Member Rucker's point, is how are we organizing around that as the intervention? And then looking at the current resources. So I agree, we are even internally looking at how we're leveraging. It's not just LCAP. We're looking at the dollars that are connected to our homeless population, our foster youth, AB 2083 in terms of this. We're looking at how our internal system of support and improvement can be leveraged, particularly around as we're developing webinars with WestEd around how to use those one-time dollars and then how to connect that conversation to community schools. We're looking at how do we not just integrate information from LCFF, but looking at the titles for sustainability along with Medi-Cal. So we're having those conversations, and I think the goal that we're looking to do is sort of use community schools as that opportunity. And I love the point about accountability, because we do have to take some time, and that's even working with the state board and community partners to really outline what are the accountability measures? Like, what are we going to be looking that defines school transformation in California? So I think we're at those stages. It might not have been communicated well, but I want to say that that's the plan, is that we start somewhere, we continue to have conversations, and that hopefully it'll be a comprehensive conversation and a plan and a framework that we can agree on. So to President Strauss, I agree. We're not trying to rush this, but I want everybody to understand that whatever gets developed in January may not be the final product. It may be where we start, and the goal is through continuous improvement that we reflect on it, we refine it, and then at the end of this process that we'll have a framework.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. And through the chair, just quickly, I wanted to just say, Board Member Rucker and other board members, we receive your feedback. Thank you for giving critical friend feedback, and that always strengthens every process. And so we will continue to take the feedback. We will continue to work to articulate how this community school strategy integrates with some of the existing frameworks that exist for supporting schools. Board Member Rucker, you referenced it. Board Member Sun, you've referenced it. We will continue to articulate that. Interestingly enough, just to build on Dr. Lee's comments, Dr. Lee is always talking about how we must create all priorities, must have that deep, deep integration. And many of the programs that you all reference are in Dr. Lee's branch. And so community schools lives in this equity branch, as does all the divisions and staff and units that work on LCAP. And so, and the systems of support. And so we hear you, we receive the feedback. And I think that given that they're all in the same branch, there is this opportunity to create that cross-threading, to create that integration. Ultimately, that will support the sustainability that I think all of you were talking about. I heard Board Member Strauss talk about that. And so just know we receive your feedback, and we will continue to polish up our work here in a way that we can articulate that integration of all of these efforts, because that's what it's going to take for success. Thank you.
Very helpful. Thank you. I have Member Glover Woods, Member Rodriguez, Member Burr, and Member Bananca. So let's go with Member Glover Woods.
Thank you, President Darling Hammond. First, I want to just again echo how important and essential the community schools will be to students who will be able to benefit from this particular model of educating students. I'm looking forward to updates and information that come forward in the future regarding the framework that is developed and all of the other updates that were shared in the presentation. I just wanted to make a couple of points. One, a very strong request to be sure that during the listening forums, all of the different feedback opportunities for the framework, as well as the community and educational partners that will be identified for the advisory council, that there's a very intentional outreach to ensure accurately representing the demographics of the schools and the students that this model will serve. I know that it's on the radar of everyone to be sure that we're not only hearing the voices in the development of this, of those who might be at state agencies, those might be in different organizations, but I'm really asking the department to do some very intentional outreach down to the grassroots of the communities to be sure that those who are speaking into the model really are demographically representative of those who will be impacted by how this is structured. My second request or suggestion is as it relates to the development of the framework. Some of my fellow board members have already talked about how this might need to coordinate and articulate with some of the existing components that we already have in our system. So what I would strongly encourage is that during the development of the actual framework, that there is language in the framework that speaks to how the community schools planning and implementation can integrate with different aspects, such as the LCAP that's been brought up. If there are schools that are eligible for certain levels of technical assistance, like differentiated assistance, what lens should be used in determining, again, how all of this coordinates with goals, actions, services that are determined in those processes, how it braids with other funding sources. So again, my request is that within the body of the framework for community schools, this community schools partnership, that there's some language that speaks to how all of this needs to integrate for the LEAs and the specific schools that will be recipients of this great program.
Thank you so much. Member Rodriguez.
Yes, thank you. I want to say also how excited I am about this. In 2012, I was ready to leave the teaching profession and education altogether. I ran into a friend of mine who was involved in California policy, educational policy, and said, hang in there. There's some great things happening in California. And then a year later, LCFF, which I got very excited about. However, one of the things that I think the NCLB compliance checklist model is still very much ingrained in a lot of our school systems, that compartmentalization, which is what was just killing my soul, right? To not be able to sit down with colleagues and plan, to not be able to sit down with parents. And when they would say, can I come and take English classes here? Well, no, because we can't have adults during school, right? You know, all of that, and all that compartmentalization that, as a person of color, it goes against my my makeup. And so seeing this item on the agenda and, you know, reading and learning a lot about community schools, Member Strauss mentioned LPI, and yesterday there was a wonderful email that I passed on to my school leadership, right, you know, hoping in preparation of this item. I just want to say how enthusiastic I am. One of the callers mentioned, and it was also mentioned here, about making sure that we have the voices of the community, Black, Indigenous, people of color. Absolutely. I think that's, you know, it seems to me the intention, and to really take the LCFF and that partnership, educational partnership model, and you know, again, to quote Member President Darlene Hammond, that transformation, right? And to make all of those connections in education that are so essential, not only for the academic and intellectual building of our students, but just the whole child, the family, the community. I envision the partnerships with attorneys coming in and civics lessons for parents. There's just so much potential within the community schools model to really build the community and the and one of the things, you know, to a caveat for me is with the technical assistance centers. I really hope, and even though, you know, like it's outlined here in the item, but I really want to see a proactive feedback, the way we give students feedback in our classes when they're working on projects, how to improve, right? You know, that continuous improvement, as opposed to coming in and going, oh, check, they have this, they have that, but really engaging and going from compliance to engagement. Our communities and our students are ready for that. So I just want to say that I feel that a lot of thought has been put into this, and I also appreciate the follow-up with the comments that have been made regarding the technical components. Thank you.
Thank you. We have Member Burr, Member Bananka, Member Patillo Bronson, and then I believe Member Sun has re-raised her hand, right? Okay. Member Burr.
Thank you, President Darling-Hammond. I don't want to be redundant, but I will associate my comments with Board Member Sun, Board Member Strauss, Board Member Rucker, around both the sort of overwhelming nature of this. While there's unbelievable promise and it's super exciting that we have this opportunity, I think we have to be very humble about the implementation of it. The one thing, and I also want to start out by saying, I think Member Rucker mentioned this, I'm not sure everybody reads our board memos. I don't mean board members, but just generally people don't. And the board memo on this item is very helpful. It helps fill in a lot of the gaps. So just for purposes people who are listening, I point you to that memo, and also want to say how much I appreciate it from the department staff and the board staff to help kind of understand. I'm a sort of a practical person here, so I want to get down to some suggestions about the practicality of moving forward with this and what would be really helpful when we see this in January. Because we have pretty clearly defined eligibility about this, seeing a list of the schools and districts who are eligible to apply would both be helpful, I think, to the board, but I would hope it would be helpful to your outreach process, so that you could identify these are the groups of schools and districts that need the help the most. It might help sort of think about where will those technical assistance centers be, or should they be placed to provide that level of assistance? Because I think at this point, I'll just say for me, this is so big, I can't get my hands around it to really understand what the implications are for the actual implementation. And I think more specifically, it goes directly to some of the comments that Board Member McQuillan made at the beginning, that we know sort of statistically how many rural schools, how many small schools we have in this state, especially north of Sacramento, that may need this kind of assistance. And if we don't see them and plan for them, then I feel like they get left out. In the good old days, we used to give flat amounts of money to necessary small schools, rural schools, because this issue about capacity and the ability of those kinds of schools and districts to actually mount the level of effort that is needed to do a contract, to do a proposal, all of that. Well, all of the resources that are going to be there once they get it are very well deserved, and people will love to have them. It's getting there that is daunting. And in this kind of environment, I think it's going to be really hard for people to think about that. So just friendly advice, critical friend advice, as Board Member Rucker said. The other thing I just want to emphasize, and I think Board Member Glover Woods brought this up, the importance of those technical assistance centers. And I think getting those up and going as quickly as you can in parallel with the planning and the implementation, again, to districts and schools that need it the most. The one thing, the sort of last two things I want to say is, for purposes of this notion about integration, and this is me talking as somebody who's the self-appointed historian, this comes across, I'll just say this, I don't mean this as kind of a negative comment, but we have to be clear that this is not a new categorical program, that this is in fact an opportunity and lots of money to help integrate all of these efforts that we have had underway for so many years to identify students who have the greatest needs and have been underserved for years, and create structures to make them successful. Because I think otherwise we're kind of losing the plot here a little bit, or at least I have. So to make sure about that, the last thing I'll say, and I appreciate the notion of continuous improvement in the process, is we really need to be humble about the timing. Superintendent Thurman got to hear my old shaggy dog story about my experience years ago working at the state level for another governor with lots of fantastic initiatives. And then I went, well, I'm going to go to a district and see how this works. And I went to the district and said, wow, we have all these great ideas, 4 big initiatives. We've got to get going. And they looked at me like I had grown 2 heads. A, they didn't know what I was talking about. B, they had a lot, as all of you who worked in districts and counties know, lots of things in place in planning that they had forward for a couple of years. And no way did these new initiatives fit in with that planning. So we always kind of are out of sync with what we're doing at the state level versus what's happening at the local level. So just again, friendly advice, be very humble about the timing and think about how this all fits in the context of a pandemic. Thank you.
Member Burke, thank you for that feedback. And I know that it mirrors a conversation that we had at the CCE board meeting recently about the importance of field testing, listening to the constituents, not having the state drive downward, but rather listening to what at the school site level people are saying that they need and then providing that. We will continue with that guiding principle. Thank you for that and for sharing the Shaggy dog story. I will tell you, as I literally sit at one of the schools that, one of the districts that is deeply interested in community schools, because we are doing what you said, we're field testing. I have to say, for a field that is so plagued by so many things, this may be the one thing that I have heard consistently from school leaders all across the state. We really, really want it. I think the biggest challenge is going to be how they apply. And you heard our team talk about how sensitive we are to not making it some hurdle to have to jump over or through or go around. But people are really feeling like community schools can make a difference for them. They're invested in it, probably because of the moment that we are coming out of and being in the pandemic. Everyone wants a community school in an urban environment, in a rural environment, frontier communities. And so, but we will continue, as you said, to use as our guiding principle, one of our guiding principles, listening to the needs of the field, working on timing. And Dr. Darling-Hammond has commented on this. We are juggling some legislative timelines that have been imposed that have to be met with how to also manage the moment and not rush and make the most of this moment. So again, feedback received, and thank you for sharing the Shaggy dog story to help articulate it.
Thank you so much. I think next in the queue is Member Bananka.
Well, first, I want to thank the CDE staff for all the great work that has been done on this item. I truly believe that this investment in community schools is going to completely transform the future of education in our state. And I'm also really happy to see that community schools really address a lot of the student proposals that we heard yesterday, like student wellness and socioeconomic support and the equitable education proposals. I agree with Member Rucker, it's awesome. But while I applaud the efforts to listen to educational partners in this process, I want to echo the remarks of Member Glover Woods in that we truly need to listen to the people most affected by this investment. And on that same line, I want to emphasize the importance of listening to students in this process. And I don't just mean one or two or a few, but I think a significant portion of the educational partners that we hear from and consider should be students, and especially unduplicated students. And the reason why I think it's so important, especially for this issue, is because community schools, as I said before, and has been repeated by many members, are going to be the future of education in California and are going to transform the state of education in the state of California. So I think it's truly essential that we listen to plenty of student voice in this process, because it's not just going to affect the millions of students in our system now, but it's going to affect millions of students in the future. And I think the way to address this is really making sure that the outreach is targeted towards students, because we as students get information in very, very different ways than adults. So making sure that the outreach is very intentionally targeted towards students, especially unduplicated pupils, I think is something that we should definitely keep in mind moving forward. But again, I applaud all of the efforts by the CDE on this investment.
Thank you, Board Member Bananka. And I should have been explicit that we not only listen to school communities, but yes, to students and to community partners and advocates. You know, we want to be as broad as we can. So thank you for helping me to clarify my statement. You know, we have recently, as state agencies, we've had to go beyond the types of places that we use to communicate. Even my own teenage children have said, "Dad, Nobody listens to Facebook anymore. Get CDE and the state board have to speak through other social mediums. And you're right. We will have to utilize formal structures and informal structures to make sure that we're lifting up the voices of students and the students that this is intended to serve. Thank you for that feedback, Board Member Benanca.
Great, thank you. I want to go to Board Member Patillo Brownson and then Member Sun.
So I also want to thank CDE and the superintendent for bringing forward this proposal. It obviously, I think, has touched off so much excitement, I think, around the state and on this board for the prospect of a different type of transformation coming through community schools. I would also just add that similar to LEA leaders, I've just heard an immense amount of community and CBO level excitement for what it means to make it. In some ways, it's almost the opposite of sort of narratives you hear about hardening schools. It's actually about softening schools and encouraging community in a different sort of partnership to sort of make it more porous, more inviting to families, to community-based organizations, to actually partner with schools in a whole different way. I think the point that Board Member Benanca just made around different mediums really for how you do the outreach is also true, not just for students, but also for parents of younger children. When we've done research around how do you actually connect with both parents of elementary, but also of 0 to 5 kids, the parents of 0 to 5 children, oftentimes the social media that is useful and impactful is not the same as it is for a 50+ demographic, which oftentimes I think is imagined to be only the province of students, but also I think is true for young parents. The last thing I wanted to just raise up is this idea of, I agree with the importance of articulation with existing state accountability formats around LCAP. And I also think it's an opportunity to be creative about a more expansive set of outcomes to strive for. There are a finite list of outcomes that are built into our LCAP, and there are slightly more expansive ones that are envisioned, I think, under the community schools aspirations. So particularly in the section of the memo addressing what those outcome measures might look like, I think there's an opportunity to think about not just test sort of achievement and the host of variables that are listed there currently, but also sort of opportunities for early learning, for after school learning, for summer learning to actually be quantified and part of what school districts can set out for their own ambitions of how they would want to see wraparound services actually touching the children in their school districts. I would add to this list, not surprisingly, access to early learning opportunities and also access to P23 articulation to ensure that those early learning foundations are smooth and actually carried from grade to grade to build the strongest foundation possible. And I think just lastly, I would say if you're hearing a whole bunch of excitement, but also feedback, it's because it's such a precious opportunity, especially given the year that we've all had. And it makes it all the more important. Thank you.
Appreciate the feedback. Thank you. And we welcome it. We want the excitement. And in many ways, this is the beginning of the listening sessions. You all are part of the listening session community. You all are giving us feedback that we can incorporate. And we're jotting down all the questions and comments. And note that you're absolutely right that there are, we do have a parent advisory council that we have been working with, that we've launched and established to get more parent voice conversation in the space, and there are other groups across the state. I'd be remiss if we didn't acknowledge that we've been working closely with the Partnership for the Future, a coalition that includes many groups, and I have to shout out Mark Philpart from Policy Link in particular, who has been crosswalking with Deanna Niebuhr a number of these conversations, and who we've invited to be in many of the conversations in the listening sessions. And so there are many people who are already helping. Your feedback is helping. I think that your point about what we measure, maybe Dr. Darling Hammond has thoughts on it too, because Dr. Darling Hammond has been a part of community schools for a long time and has been a big advocate and has worked on it at the ground level, at the community level. I think in many ways, community schools have always been sort of trying to figure out the best way to show the impact of the programs. We know instinctually that community schools help students be more successful academically, because when you remove a physical barrier or a health barrier or a mental health barrier or even a social justice barrier, and we completely align with the work to soften what happens on school campuses, to reverse the hardening of what's going on school campuses. We completely align with that. But how do we measure the impact? We'll continue these conversations and look forward to engaging with you all about the best ways that we can identify to measure those impacts to our schools.
Thank you. I think Member Sun and then Member Rucker has raised her hand again. I do want to start to bring our conversation to a fine point and a close, because we have yet another agenda item. And I know that people are listening carefully, so we don't have to repeat what we've said, but we can add some new ideas. Member Sun.
Yeah, so that's what I was hoping to do. That, I know the staff has heard about the cohesion, coherence, and all that. So what I'm hoping that what we've done in this conversation is kind of shifted thoughts from the staff about the messaging of this initiative, that from one of, this is a great initiative that we should all strive towards, to one that might be what Dr. Lee had alluded to, is how all these different parts will fit in to create. And it's a little bit different than how it was presented before. I think that, being a little bit more humble in how that messaging is, that we're honoring work that has already been done in the field over these past many years, and that this is the community schools is the gestalt, if you will, of all these parts. And therefore the technical assistance centers, all that is really a means, because we really need a means to bring cohesion into the system with all these different funding aspects and all that. And so maybe thinking about this as a way of coordinating these, and that may be very well where the staff has been, but it has not been articulated necessarily clearly in that way.
Member Rucker.
And I'm glad to follow Board Member Stein on this point, because that was also the suggestion I was going to add. Let me ask you to also think about, in looking at your planning, to pull back a little bit and looking at the architecture of what you've laid out in front of us. Where are the inflection points on the implementation and planning in this activity? And specifically, right now, it is the department and your leadership councils and your technical advisory committees and centers that are doing the work of helping districts get started with this. But at some point, the districts and the school sites where these programs are going to unfold and blossom become the drivers. Where are those inflection points, and where are you looking for and planning for that transition where the districts and the local level activities become the leading forces and the leading drivers for the full implementation of this process? I think that needs to be considered. And the reason why I'm asking you to think about that is, at the state level, who your partners are and who your community or collaborators are look very different than at the local level when they start looking at their partners. When districts start looking around the community, they're not going to think about these statewide groups that the superintendent named that are collaborating with the department, but they are going to need to look for the businesses and the local community leaders, the fraternities, the sororities, all of those community groups that have some engagement in some ways, even the barber shops and the beauty shops, all of those people who get involved in the schools for a lot of different reasons. Those are the groups that districts need to know to look for, because that's where their natural allies are. And I think that those inflection points and those differences at those inflection points need to be made plain and need to be made given some appearance and awareness as well.
Yeah. And let me just note that that's the kind of thing that's supposed to come back to us in January. So in an attempt to segue us from here to there, I think we've heard from all the folks who wanted to add comments from the board. I think there may be a couple of points that staff want to bring to our attention. I got a note that maybe Deanna wants to help us understand something about the flow of the grant process, if that's still the case. I make a little room for that, and then we'll see if we can get to a motion.
If President Linda Dolham, if I can make one comment, then I'll pass it on.
Sure, please do. Yeah.
Deanna. I guess I really appreciate the feedback because, like I told a lot of our community partners in our conversations, I think we're more closer aligned than what we think. Like, I think we're conscious of sort of the process, how we need to be considerate of the system. But I love the point, particularly from Member Glover and Son around the integration. Like, we have to be intentional about that, and also making sure we can be explicit. And I think that's really our role so in this process. So I want to make sure that when we leave this conversation, that's the plan, and that's what we can produce when we get you sort of the next update. So thank you for the feedback, and I'll pass it to you.
All I was going to do is make a point of clarification about the advisory council, the proposed advisory council, and our relationship with the board. And around grant awards, it's the board that would approve the grant awards, not an advisory council. So just a point of order.
Okay, yeah, that must have been a comment that came by. I think one of the things that's clear by the representation from the department by Superintendent Thurman and Dr. Lee and the set of folks who are all working on this makes clear is how much the department is taking this as a central activity, which I think bodes well for the coherence and integration concerns that have been raised. And, I think we really appreciate that it really is being considered a department-wide activity. So, we're looking forward to that. I think we heard the point that there was a lot of good information in the memo that may also be part of the communication going forward, that we want to be sure that that good thinking is also getting communicated to the field, as well as some of the points that have been raised here. We know the department staff is really busy doing all of this work to get ready for the expectation that people have that there will be some resources that reach the field before next school year. So that is so that in fact that capacity building can begin. So anyway, I want to just thank the department again for all of the energy to date and all that will follow. We know you're hearing and listening on a mega scale to both these comments and to others. And I want to see if we are ready for a motion. Do we want to put the slide back up with the resolution that was proposed? There we go. So, Member Escobedo, I see you have a new hand up.
Yes, I would like to motion to approve the California Department of Education recommendation of the California Community Schools Partnership Program, proposed application process and administration plan, namely to grant the RFA timeline, the regional TAC RFA timeline and basic contract eligibility and requirements, and broad community engagement and listening process.
Thank you. Member Rodriguez?
I would like to second the motion.
Thank you. Is there any further discussion? Member Rucker, is your hand up anew or is it still up from before?
Up from before. I apologize.
That's okay. Just checking. Any further discussion? If not, we'll take a vote on the motion. And Brooks, can you please take the roll call vote?
Member Banaka.
Aye.
Member Burr.
Aye.
President Darling Hammond.
Aye.
Member Escobedo.
Aye.
Member Glover Woods.
Yes.
Member McQuillan.
Yes.
Member Patillo Brownson.
Yes.
Member Rodriguez,
Yes.
Member Rucker,
Yes.
Vice President Strauss,
Yes.
Member Sun.
Aye.
The motion passes unanimously.
Thank you. And we're ready for a break. Is there anything else you wanted to say, Superintendent Thurman, before we get our cup of coffee?
I won't separate you from the cup of coffee. Thank you, President Darling and members of the board for your action just now. I think that the conversation was welcome. It reflects what we hear every time we talk about this with any community partner. There are great hopes and dreams that everyone has for the Community Schools Initiative. We take your feedback. We've jotted down lots of notes about the things that you said, and we'll be delving into it further. So we want to thank you for that. We are thinking about how we do this well, and we're also thinking about sustainability. This should not be a one and done conversation. This should not be that when every grant dollar has been used, there are no longer any more community schools. This should be something that becomes part of the fabric of what happens in our schools. And for that reason, we care about what you all said about creating the connective tissue, the connective fiber to many of the existing strategies, and we'll continue to do that. I also just want to acknowledge that we've had a lot of help from the CDE Foundation to help us raise dollars to be able to do some of the coordination and to get research to support it. I want to acknowledge Jessica Howard and her staff and the folks at the CDE Foundation. There are many foundations that have been interested in this, and we're meeting with many of them. They're interested in public-private partnerships and the sustainability and the braiding of funds to make this happen. So thank you for today's push and today's action, and we'll be ready to report back to you as we go. Thank you, Madam President, and we'll see you on the next item.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Let's take a 10-minute break, and we'll see you back at 11:46. All right. Welcome back. Board members, we need to reestablish the quorum. So, Brooks, can you please call the roll?
Member Banaka.
Here.
Member Burr.
Here.
President Darling Hammond.
Here.
Member Escobedo.
Here.
Member Glover Woods.
Here.
Member McQuillan.
Here.
Member Patillo Brownson.
Here.
Member Rodriguez.
Here.
Member Rucker.
Here.
Vice President Strauss.
Here.
Member Sun.
Here.
Everyone's present. We have a quorum.
That's wonderful. We're going to item 18, which is the new targets for the state performance plan indicators in the annual performance report for Part B of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act of 2004, covering program years 2020-21 through 2025-26. The CDE recommends that we approve the proposed new targets covering those years, and this item will be presented by Heather Calamise of the department and Mary Sandy of the California Commission on Teacher Credentialing. Take it away.
Great, thank you so much. A pleasure to be here today. Certainly time flies, and so we return again to continue the conversation on the proposed state performance plan targets, along with an update from the CTC. During today's presentation, you will have a chance to hear about how California has progressed on recommendations made by the Special Education Task Force from 2015, and an update from our partner, Mary Sandy at the CTC. We will then conclude the presentation with a recap of the proposed targets that we discussed and that you saw last time, and discuss a few critical areas to our work of improving outcomes for students. The themes and recommendations surfaced in the report just 6 years ago remain as salient as ever. And so I think it's abundantly clear that the work of the task force report, the state performance plan proposed targets, and all the investments and work groups and reports that are ongoing currently all point and signal to a system, as I stated before, that is in need of additional changes and shifts in order to improve our outcomes for students with disabilities across the state. As a reminder, once approved, these targets will be submitted to OSEP in 2022 as part of our state performance plan and annual performance report. In January of 2022, you will hear how California students are progressing on the indicators. And what we do know is that we will likely continue to see impacts on our data due to the disruptions of the COVID-19 pandemic, but more on that in January. In 2013, a statewide task force on special education comprised of 34 representatives from key education partners embarked on a study to document the reasons special education was not as successful and what must be changed in both policy and practice to ensure and improve services for all children identified under IDEA as having a disability. The result of this work was a 2015 report entitled One System, Reforming Education to Serve All Students, a report of California's statewide task force on special education. The culminating report, published by the task force in 2015, laid out a myriad of system reforms designed to improve educational outcomes for students with disabilities. Additional information about the task force can be found in the March 9th, 2015 memo on our website, but the report itself is now finalized and will be posted on our website soon. Among the task force recommendations was an overarching conclusion that California's special education system would improve if general education and special education work seamlessly together as one coherent system designed to address the needs of all students. The 2015 One System report also stated that improving how the state educates students with disabilities enhances education for all students as well. As you can see from the slide, the report addressed a number of broad topic areas, each one critical and important to the health of a high-functioning special education system. And now I'll take a moment to walk through briefly each of the 7 areas that the report looked at, made recommendations on, and and recap some of the milestones that the report had noted in terms of the time frame between 2015 and to date. In terms of assessment and accountability, the task force report called for improvements to how California school teams set goals and assess the progress of students with disabilities. The report envisioned an individualized education program process that evolves and adapts to the changing landscape of education for all students. The report made the following recommendations, and I won't recap all of them, but just a few. Align IEP goals to the current California state standards. Keep parents informed of the changes in standards, the rationale for those changes, the implications for IEPs and courses of study, and strategies for supporting children at home. Ensure teachers and schools are accountable for the progress that students with the most significant cognitive disabilities make in meeting the standards, and create and disseminate samples of standard-aligned IEPs along with comprehensive training on adapting those examples or models for use in IEP meetings. And finally, the report made a recommendation of creating a common data gathering system to record and report on student IEP goals, monitor progress towards goals, and evaluate implementations of standard-based IEPs. And as you can see from the milestones before you here, some of the ones that are captured, that the report captured, in addition, is the adoption of the California Alternative Assessment. It's designed for our students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. We have seen the migration of the entire special education data system merge into CalPADS. There is was a current IEP template work group that just concluded. Report is now finalized, and so that report does make several recommendations on not only improving the IEP template in and of itself, but also making recommendations for improving the IEP process. And additionally, there are, in terms of dashboard and differentiated assistance, and also the special education governance and accountability study, which is also currently being finalized as well. In terms of family engagement, the report called for improvements to family and student engagement activities and opportunities, which are critical to the school and life success of children with disabilities. The report made a few recommendations. The first one is fully fund family empowerment centers, or FECs, statewide, as already legislated in SB 511, so that each of the 32 FEC regions has a center. The second was increase funding to those centers. And one of the third biggest ones was establish a data collection system to monitor the work done by the centers as well. And as we can see here, in terms of the milestones, timely in the sense of this budget cycle has brought an expansion of funding to the family empowerment centers of roughly $6.6 million. the establishment of the Family Engagement Office at CDE. And also there are new guidance and resources added to the local control funding formula Priority 3, family involvement. And then there's also $150 million expansion of alternative dispute resolution as well. In terms of special education financing, the report called for improvements to special education financing that provides the necessary resources necessary to address the following: meeting the needs of all students with disabilities, encouraging greater coherence between general education and special education, that is sensitive to changes in enrollment and investments in the systems, and provides incentives for practices that will eventually lead to greater outcomes for students. The report made the following recommendations: equalize the state's support for special education across California by overhauling the system of special education financing to give schools and districts more control over how they spend their money and to hold them accountable for adequately meeting the needs of students with disabilities. Ensure the availability of early intervention programs and services for all eligible students with disabilities, and address the disparity of early intervention programs and services among early childhood care and education entities. And finally, and again, this list is not inclusive, but expand ADR resources, supports, and services throughout the state as well. And just a couple of the milestones captured here: increasing the base rate for per pupil base rate for special education programs. There is a $656 million allocation for new and ongoing funding for special education. And again, looking at the alignment of funding and programs for early learning and care. In terms of early learning, the task force described early learning as essential to providing the inclusive runway for children with disabilities as they enter the education system. The report made some of the following recommendations: increase coordination and access to high-quality early care and preschool for all students, especially for students with disabilities, children who grow up in poverty, and children who are dual language learners, with access not dependent upon geography or service provider. Increase funding to provide equitable financial support to high-quality early care and education, and support equity of access for children with disabilities throughout the state. And again, finally, articulate family-friendly protocols for transitioning between Part C and Part B services. And as you can see here, the milestones to date that have been captured by the report is the prioritized expansion of the Supporting Inclusive Practices Program, or SIP. And as many of you know, that project has been receiving an additional $15 million of funding over the next 5 years through this budget cycle. And then increased focus and efforts on training of the preschool learning foundations. There is the master plan for early learning and care, and then expanded support to embedded instruction throughout the inclusive early education expansion program. Evidence-based school and classroom practices. The task force report described evidence-based practices as essential to providing the inclusive learning opportunities for students with disabilities. The report made the following recommendations. Universal Design for Learning, or UDL, is implemented and established as a critical area in professional learning for educator training and has a broad understanding in all schools. That MTSS is developed throughout the state, incorporating a robust and aligned systems at all organizational levels that support response to instruction and intervention approaches and systematic programs of academic, behavioral, and social emotional learning. That general education resources are used to intervene as early as possible with evidence-based and multi-tiered social emotional supports before a referral to special education services, among others. Sorry. In terms of the updates that the report highlighted, is noting that there should be prioritized and enhanced access to the MTSS framework through the Scaling Up Multi-Tiered System of Supports, or SUMS initiative. That there's currently funding allocated to the California Teacher Workforce Investment Grant and awarded to the California Coalition for Inclusive Literacy, and that there are statewide coordination efforts throughout the state through the statewide system of support, including the self-improvement and content leads to implement evidence-based practices for students with disabilities. And finally, the last bucket is educator preparation and professional learning. The report described educator preparation and professional learning as a coherent approach to educator preparation and learning, a common foundation for all instruction, or a common trunk, and multiple pathways for teachers to earn a credential. California's system of teacher credentialing would ensure that all teachers, both general and special education, enter the profession able to effectively use needs-based interventions and collaborate with other educators in a unified system. The report made just a few of the following recommendations: that general and special education preparation programs should require all aspiring teachers to master content standards, evidence-based strategies, pedagogy, intervention strategies, and collaboration amongst teachers across assignments, especially in a common trunk of preparation between general and special educators. That special education credentials should be designed to prepare teachers and address the instructional needs of all students and not just specific disability types. And at the same time, specific authorizations for educating students with low incidence disabilities, students who have lost their hearing or vision, and for example, should remain critically valuable to the component of special education. And just a few of the updates in terms of the milestones that have been achieved since then. There's significant investment in the Golden State Teacher Grant Program for students enrolled in the California California Commission on Teacher Credentialing approved teacher preparation programs. Ooh, it's a mouthful. The development of the 21st Century California School Leadership Academy to provide high-quality professional learning opportunities to LEAs, and then professional learning opportunities for paraprofessionals through the Supporting Inclusive Practices, or SIP project. Last time I discussed the factors or conditions that are at play in our highly complex system, so this slide should be familiar. And I want to take a moment to focus on the first factor or condition that has now reached beyond crisis levels. A highly skilled, trained, and supported teacher workforce is foundational to student success. And not only that, we often have seen that a lack of teachers, a supply issue, often ends up in diminished outcomes for students with disabilities and students placed in more restrictive settings. The California Commission on Teacher Credentialing, or CTC, has been instrumental in bringing about a forward-thinking approach to ensure every teacher across California has a pathway that we hope will be a fruitful and enriching career. Joining me today is Mary Sandy, who is the Executive Director of the California Commission on Teacher Credentialing, and Mary will provide an update on the milestones achieved to date on teacher preparation and discuss the work ahead. And Mary, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Heather. So will you run the slides for me? Okay, terrific. Thank you so much. Good morning or good afternoon at this point, Madam President, members of the board, Superintendent Thurmond, and colleagues. It's really a pleasure to join you and have this moment to reflect on the extraordinary amount of work that we've done since the Special Education Task Force report was produced. Next slide, please. I'm really quite proud of the work that we did. This was a collaborative effort co-sponsored by the State Board of Education, the Department of Education, and the Commission on Teacher Credentialing. It's evidence that when the three agencies come together with a focus, there are amazing things that we can do. And the frame that really, I think, centers this report, especially for our work at the Commission, can be captured in this quote: "In a coherent system of education, all children are considered general education students first, and all educators, regardless of which students they are assigned to serve, have a collective responsibility to see that all children receive the education and supports they need to maximize their development and potential so that they can participate meaningfully in the nation's economy and democracy." It's a bit of a rallying flag for the work that I know we've been doing here at the Commission, and I know that the department has been doing as well. Next slide, please. And as Heather already kind of gave the broad scope here, this was a bold report and a bold blueprint or plan for how to bring a coordinated systemic set of changes to bear in special education to improve outcomes for our students with disabilities. I won't go over these topics again, but the scope of this work was extensive. Next slide. And in educator preparation and professional learning, as Heather has already summarized briefly, we were really guided by this particular frame that California's system of teacher credentialing needs to ensure that all teachers, both general education and special education, enter the profession able to effectively use needs-based interventions and collaborate with other educators in a unified system. That seems like it should be patently obvious that that's what we're doing in schools, but it really is patently obvious that we're not doing this in the schools as well as we need to. Three of the big ideas that came out of this report focused on credentialing had to do, first of all, with establishing this common trunk of preparation that all teachers, general education and special education, could experience together. Secondly, this concept that special education teachers should be preparing teachers to address the instructional needs of all students and not focus specifically only on disability types, but to look across the array and intensity of needs and maintain specialized credentials for low incidence areas where we need them. Finally, this notion of what special educators should be authorized to do. The report envisioned special educator teachers being prepared and authorized to instruct and provide any needed support to general education students as well as students with disabilities. This really is a kind of platform from MTSS and the kinds of settings we're putting together where teachers are working together to serve students in a very comprehensive way. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about the context in which this report landed and go a little deeper on some of the supply, demand, and capacity issues that were present in 2015 when this report came out. And really prior to 2015, when class size reduction was enacted in 1998, there was an immediate shortage of teachers to staff the classrooms that needed to be staffed. We hit a high point of 45,000 emergency permit holders working in our schools before we really caught up with that. And there was significant state investment to grow teacher preparation program capacity. And that was a really critical part of trying to bring the shortages. We almost eradicated them with the state investment strategy at the time. We moved from 45,000 emergency permit holders to less than 2,000 being issued annually. And that was an extraordinary victory in terms of making sure we had fully prepared teachers working in our classrooms. Also, while class size reduction was being enacted, the commission had undergone a revision in its special education credential. And one of the things that happened at that time that may have contributed to many of the issues we're facing right now was a separation within the special education credential used to require that a teacher hold a general education credential first, and that they add the special education credential on top of that. And what that led to was a teacher who was fully able, prepared, and able to work across all settings in schools. The shortages led to a policy change where the commission separated these credentials. And what emerged from that was more siloed preparation, teachers who were not coming in and drawing from the same core sets of knowledge, skills, and abilities to work in the schools. And while there may have been some short-term gains in terms of some of the numbers of special educators being credentialed, the long-term effect has been significant and I think corrosive to the work that we need our teachers to be able to do. And some of this was captured, following that high point of investment where we almost eradicated teacher shortages. The Getting Down to Facts report documented, and that came out in 2018, documented that between 2001 and 2017, overall teacher preparation enrollments in California for all subjects declined by more than 70%. 70%. That's significant. During the recession, 30 special education programs were put on moratorium status or reduced in size, and 4 programs were eliminated outright, 2 in moderate to severe disabilities and 2 in early childhood special education. Getting Down to Facts further documented that between 2015-16 and 2016-17, 13.4% of teachers teaching in special education schools left the profession or the state. and another 7.3% moved between schools within California. Combined, more than 1 out of every 5 teachers teaching in special education schools left their position, which was more than any other subject. Next slide, please. So where are we today with shortages? And it continues to be significant. We are seeing that we are issuing as many intern, emergency permit, and waiver documents allowing teachers to teach as we are preliminary credentials. It's almost 50-50 right now. In 2018-19, we issued 13,340 new teaching credentials to teachers fully prepared. They earned preliminary credentials and moved into the schools. And 13,912 intern credentials, emergency permits, and waivers. In special education, the situation is even worse. The commission issued 3,300 new teaching credentials and over 5,000 intern credentials, emergency permits, and waivers. We're staffing our classrooms with people who are underprepared for the work, and we're staffing those classrooms in significant ways that are impacting opportunities for children. 2 out of every 3 new special education recruits enter the field without having completed preparation. That's significant. This is special education. This work is not for the underprepared. All right. So since 2015, the commission has approved 10 new education specialist intern programs sponsored for the most part by local education agencies. So from the time of reduction and moratorium, we've begun to build back, but we are nowhere near the enrollments that we had, or the capacity and preparation that we had when we almost eradicated the shortage. It's interesting to note that growth is occurring most rapidly in terms of numbers of new programs in the development of internship programs. There's some very many strong intern programs that can really assist teachers in training to learn their work and to be effective in the classroom. But it's more challenging than a student teaching-based program where you have the opportunity to see expert teachers teach and have more practice opportunities than you do when you're the teacher of record. Employers are reporting to us, they're actually reporting to the Department of Education, and we look at it every year, the need to hire about 20,000 teachers every year. And that number stayed pretty stable over the last several years of reporting. California institutions are producing less than half that number of fully prepared teachers. So from the get-go, California is not preparing the number of teachers needed to meet the demand that employers are expressing to us. We are currently receiving about 20 to 25% of our new teachers are coming from out of state. Next slide, please. So this graphic simply shows you the comparison between the dark blue column, which is new, preliminary, or clear credentials. The furthest to the left, the furthest to the left columns are all teachers. Special education, you can see 3,300 in the dark blue, 5,000 in the light blue column, interns, permits, and waivers, and then math and special education. So moving to the next slide, please. What's interesting when we just take the slice of these data and look at the intern, permit, and waiver population of teachers. These are teachers who have not been fully prepared. Interns are in a program and are getting support and supervision and weekly engagement with their program and with their employers. But these constitute the underprepared workforce. The largest proportion for each year has been to folks receiving emergency permits and waivers and not interns. So we're sending a lot of people into the schools who are not prepared to do this work. Moving to the next slide, please. So what have we been doing at the commission? Since the task force report was established, the commission has undertaken a significant overhaul of its teacher preparation standards for general education, for special education, and now we are in the process of updating and overhauling our standards for early childhood education. In 2016, we adopted new standards for general ed. 2018, we restructured the special ed credential and adopted new standards for it. we have built and developed performance assessments to go with these programs. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. So a significant driver of change in the general education standards for teacher preparation has been driving inclusive practices into the center of preparation of our general education teachers. This was a major theme and a major call out by the task force in the report, that inclusion is not a special education issue, it's a general education issue. And moving back to the concept and driven ever by the call that all teachers are teachers of all students, and all students are general education students first, and all students need intervention at different times. Inclusion was the primary set of changes in the gen ed space. We focused in these standards on establishing and maintaining inclusive learning environments, really looking at the environment. Universal design for learning is a required element of teacher preparation and our performance assessments. Learning about and working within, learning how to work within a multi-tiered system of support. The use of technology to enhance access to instruction, including assistive technology for diverse learners. Providing supportive learning environments for students with disabilities who may also be English learners, monitoring progress on IEPs. This is all work that gen ed teachers are now required to engage in as they work toward a credential. But I think a primary theme here is adapting their instructional practice. We really have taken that model to heart in the standards and how we prepare teachers, that you know what you're doing as a teacher. You set out with a plan, but you must be ready to adapt your practice to incorporate and recognize the assets that your students bring to the learning moment, and to adjust your instructional practices to meet the needs that these students bring. So that's what we've done in general ed. And we have programs that have been up and running for several years now in this way. Moving to the next slide. In special education, the structure of the credential itself was changed. We moved from having 7 distinct special education credentials to having 5 of them. The language and academic development and physical and health impairment credential areas had I think we had 1 preparation program in each of those areas. The low incidence lack of opportunity to be prepared in those areas led to a necessary incorporation of that content into the other 5 remaining credentials. So now we issue a mild to moderate support needs, extensive support needs, deaf and hard of hearing, visual impairments, and early childhood special education set of credentials. There's a significant transition from the focus on specific disability categories to the idea that of intensity of support needs, from mild to moderate to extensive support needs, where teachers are prepared to work across all disability areas with a difference in the level of intensity and the types of services that students needs in the classroom. So there's also an additional emphasis and focus on language development, communication, behavior support, and additional knowledge to support students across disability categories. So these new standards were adopted in 2018. They incorporate the general education performance expectations as the core, as the common trunk. This is maybe the most significant change we've made in these 2 credential areas, and that is to establish a set of universal teaching performance expectations that all teachers are prepared in on their way to getting a credential. Moving to the next slide. Teaching performance assessments have been a tool that we've been working with in California for 20 years. Initially, we were funded with a federal grant to develop a performance assessment using the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards as a kind of model for the kind of reflective work that teachers should be able to do. We've built performance assessments, and in the last 6 years, we've updated those we had and expanded our capacity. TPAs are embedded in coursework and in clinical practice, and they have been developed and updated so that candidates can demonstrate their ability to use universal design for learning to plan instruction, where they're focusing both on the assets that students bring and the needs that they bring to the learning moment. In general education, the teachers who take the TPA are required to take a look at the students in their clinical practice and identify a student who's an English learner, a student with disabilities or exceptional needs, and a student with life experiences that might impact their learning, and do some analytic work here. What are the assets and needs, and how will I use those things as I design a lesson or as a unit of instruction using UDL as the guide for how to do that? And then they're required to develop in a planning segment how they're going to attend to those needs. They're also required in this TPA to teach and record their teaching, to evaluate and reflect on what happened in the teaching of the lesson that I designed, who got it, who didn't get it, and to determine what they're going to do next. How are they going to apply what they learned from doing this? This is the plan, teach, assess, reflect, apply habit of mind that we're really trying to inculcate in teachers through teacher preparation and through performance assessments, so that this becomes the way in which they approach their instruction. The special education form of TPA follows the same DNA as the general education, building off of the common trunk of preparation. The special education candidates, of course, are focused on students with IEPs. They are asked to demonstrate how they communicate and collaborate with and co-teach with other educators, which is a critical part of that work. And they also are expected to include families, guardians in their the educational process and talk about how they're incorporating that into their work. So TPAs have been a major tool for us to organize clinical practice and to really help teachers move from the abstract to the concrete and demonstrate their skill before they get a credential. So moving to the next slide, please. So we currently have 141 education specialist programs that are in the process of redesign to meet our new standards. They are being offered by 70 institutions across the state. 68 of them are focused on mild to moderate support needs and will offer that program. 47 of them are focused on the extensive support needs credential. 46 of these programs are focusing specifically on both mild to moderate support needs and extensive support needs. We have 18 programs in development for early childhood special education, 6 for deaf and hard of hearing, and 2 for visual impairments. Next slide, please. Back to the concept of dual credential pathways and looking for ways to get back to some of the important things that we lost when we separated these credentials. We currently have 12 programs, these that are listed on the slide, who are, these programs and institutions have been offering dual credential programs all along, and as they're redesigning, they are designing that as part of their new program as well. Next slide. We did a survey just in the last couple of weeks of the 70 institutions offering these 141 programs that are in redesign, just to ask them, to what extent are you blending preparation for your general ed and your special ed candidates so they're taking the same coursework, big goal of the task force report, big goal of our standards and teacher ed reform. We also asked them how many of them are pursuing dual credential pathways. 41 of those 70 institutions responded, and 32 of them said they either have been or are designing their programs to enable this general and special education co-experience of common courses. 17 of these 41 programs are designing new programs or continuing their programs that include the dual credential pathways. They've expressed some challenges to us as they're in the process of redesign. They are, of course, working within many institutions where these programs have been siloed, and getting the special education and the general education faculty into a collaborative space to co-design is more challenging in some places than others. Staffing is an issue that some of them have also raised. While some programs have faculty from general ed and special education co-teaching common courses, others are struggling to figure out how they finance that, how they staff or operationalize this approach. They are 1 year away from having to be offering these new programs. So they're still in the final design phases, but getting ready to be reviewed. And so it's still moving. It's not completely settled and stable yet. Many of our preliminary preparation programs are offering intern pathways, and some of them are expressing to us concern about how do we go for a dual credential in general education and special education if our special ed candidate is in a special ed assignment, and they're trying to figure out how at the local level they can get the kinds of cross-pollination and clinical experience they need to add both credentials. But they're working on it. There's not disinterest, there's interest. So moving to the next slide, please. I wanted to give you a couple of quick examples. Loyola Marymount University has put together a combined coursework sequence that's listed on this slide. They've identified 5 courses that are common trunk courses: teaching English learners, access, inclusion, and belonging, cross-content methods, elementary literacy, equity and diversity. And then they have 5 additional courses that are education specialist only. They focus on the field work component of this, digging in around evidence-based assessment practices to promote student learning, and working on effective environments in support of student learning. What's important about the common experience here and the opportunity for all teachers in preparation to think about teaching English learners together is that they develop this understanding of each other's practice and the continuum of services and instructional strategies that are used to support our children with disabilities. And this is a really critical piece that we're driving toward. Next slide, please. The California Alliance for Inclusive Schooling is a group that has come together under the leadership of the CSU Chancellor's Office and the Thompson Policy Institute at Chapman University that's really focusing in the teacher education community on how to maximize inclusive practices. And they received funding from CEDAR, which is a National Technical Assistance Center funded by the U.S. Department of Education Special Education Programs. They issued us 8 mini grants 2 years ago to stimulate work in either combining your coursework or working toward dual credentials. So Long Beach used their mini grant to develop and work on their urban dual credential program. It's a pathway, it's a 2-year pathway where candidates earn both the multiple subject and the education specialist credential. It can be completed either as a post-baccalaureate program or as integrated within a bachelor's degree or alongside a bachelor's degree program. They complete their credential courses at an elementary school site with a cohort beginning every fall. They complete 12 units of student teaching in a high-need urban school setting alongside their mentor teachers in 2-year clinical placement model. I went and visited this particular program, and I just have to say that the students and the candidates that I met in this program inspired me. If ever you despair, you should go and visit a program like this because the energy and excitement and drive that these young people have for this work is profoundly important. And I asked them, and this is a room full, there might have been 40 or 50 candidates in the room, and I asked them, all right, you're going for both credentials. If you're offered a job as a special education teacher or a gen ed teacher, which one are you going to pick? The vast majority said they would pick special education. It was heartening and exciting to see, and to see their collaboration across each other. Moving along to another example, next slide, please. UC Santa Barbara also received a mini grant, and they've been focusing on infusing new content into their existing courses and how they're supervising candidates in the field. Their faculty are working together in teams to develop course materials, working on a collaborative supervision model, and a series of co-taught course sessions. So they really have taken this seriously as well and are using the grant to good effect. Next slide, because I'm running a little bit out of time, I think, getting close to the end. The University of Laverne is another case where they have used their mini grant to really deepen their partnerships with local schools, where they do their clinical practice and co-teaching. Their common trunk courses are taught by ed specialist faculty and general ed faculty together to great effect. Moving on to the next slide. I just want to quickly say that the story that I drew earlier about shortages is dire, and it would be extremely dire if we didn't have the kind of investments that we've had and that are available right now. In the last several years, we had a $10 million grant fund to support the development of undergraduate pathways for STEM and special ed. We issued 41 grants of $250,000 each for planning to institutions that had these programs. They developed 90 distinct program pathways, 18 of them in special education. We had 400 students enrolled in the 1920 year across all program types, 95 of them in special education, 13 degree and credentials issued to date in special education. $50 million for local solution grants, funding to support the hiring of 3,600 teachers in special education. Also a very successful program and very popular with the local education agencies, where they could use these funds for loan repayment. They could offer that to their new hires, signing bonuses, stipends, the extra stipends for special education teachers, et cetera. More than 2,000 individual candidates or teachers have participated in this program to date. $45 million for the classified school employee teacher grant. This has been a very popular grant program. We have 44 LEAs currently funded to support 2,260 classified staff. More than 1,300 have been credentialed so far, 619 of them in special education. This program has $125 million beginning this year for expansion. Next slide. $51 million was made available initially to support teacher residency grant programs. 37 grants were issued to date. 234 residents were enrolled last year, just under half of them in special education. 70% are completing their programs in a year. Others are taking 18 months if they're adding special education. 70% of the residents enrolled in this program self-identify as people of color. So we're moving the needle on diversifying the teaching profession, key goal also. That's a similar statistic available for the classified grant program. We have $350 million in our budget to give away over the next 5 years, which will support up to 13,000 residents. Critical program, critical strategy for LEAs experiencing shortages. Additionally, there's the $500 million grant fund for the Golden State Teacher Grant that'll support up to 25,000 teachers coming in over the coming years. Next slide, please. So in summary, we took the task force report seriously. We were faced with conditions that were dire, as we saw the reduction of capacity from the class size reduction high point to today. Those reductions in capacity have been significant, and they're still with us. We believe in the credentialing process, we've set the stage to prepare the teachers that we need for our students in a common trunk of preparation with areas of specialization and the ability to move seamlessly into MTSS settings. And this is important stage setting. And moving on to the final slide, I just want to end with what are some next steps that we think are necessary in order to really turn the corner. First of all, the data I shared with you earlier, it definitely suggests, if it doesn't shout, that we need to double the number of teachers coming through teacher preparation programs in California if we're going to address shortages and keep up with demand. Secondly, what is going to be required there is to really build institutional capacity, or to rebuild it, if you will, to prepare special education teachers. Multiple subject teachers are another area of shortage, and with universal transition kindergarten coming down the pike, that situation could get worse if we don't begin to really make sure our preparation programs can produce the numbers of teachers that we need. The expansion of MTSS is really also quite necessary. We need more clinical practice sites and settings in MTSS settings if we really want the workforce we're preparing to get it and be able to work within it. Finding a way to incentivize the development of dual credential programs and blended preparation for general and special education teachers is also something that would be extremely useful. And finally, collectively, we have to be thinking about and problem solving around attrition in the teaching force across the board, and particularly in special education. And as has been quoted to me as recently as last night, if we can cut our attrition in half, we will address the teacher shortage. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to join Heather in this presentation, and I'll turn it back over to you now, Heather.
Great, thank you so much, Mary. It's clear the numbers are astonishing that you walked us through at the beginning of your presentation. But I think it's extremely encouraging to see and hear and know the CTC is sort of leading the charge and ensuring that our workforce is poised to sort of meet the challenges ahead in terms of ensuring that we have a high quality, highly trained teacher in every single special education classroom. So, and now just it's I want to spend some time sort of shifting our focus back into the proposed indicators and really talk about sort of what's next and sort of what's important for us to focus on in order to improve some of those outcomes. And as Mary has indicated, teacher workforce is critical to that in terms of solving the puzzle. And so I'm glad that we were able to capture that conversation here today. And so we believe that a successful school experience is heavily influenced by an educational setting or least restrictive environment, as we term it. Students that begin in highly segregated settings tend to stay in those restrictive settings over time throughout their educational career. And as I stated at the last board meeting, educational setting often has a correlation, or direct correlation to student behavior, which oftentimes can result in removal from educational settings or removal into more restrictive settings, as we know. And so it's the IEP team decision of how supports and services will be provided is such an important conversation, as we know, again, that inappropriate settings lead to increased behaviors that can also lead to suspension and expulsion. Therefore, a lack of access to curriculum and teaching and learning. And again, ensuring students are making progress towards statewide standards is also an indicator of how effective the supports and services are in providing the tools necessary for students to access the curriculum. And as we head towards graduation, ensuring our students are equipped with the skills and tools necessary to navigate life post-school is a huge monumental task and requires the efforts of many, both at the agency level and the local level, to ensure that our students graduate high school and have a clear pathway ahead in terms of what that means for their future and able to make meaningful contributions to the community that they live in. In terms of the targets themselves, I just want to recap the targets that we went through last time. I will not walk through every single target, but did want to provide just a brief overview of the trajectory that we have laid out over the next 6 years in terms of ensuring that we are, first and foremost, creating rigorous targets, as that is obviously key to maintain a high level of high standards in terms of what we expect, in terms of the performance for our students. And so just, again, don't want to walk through them all, but did want to note to you that in indicator 3, the third line down, you see the word various, and various just denotes that, if you remember last time, that that indicator now is split out into 3 grade levels, 4, 8, and 11, to greater capture growth or lack thereof growth. And so that information can be found in page 12 of your packet if you want to take a look at those targets as well. Did want to note as well that there are compliance targets that are set strictly by OSEP, and OSEP set those targets, and the California Department of Education must meet them, and those are 4B, suspension, expulsion by race and ethnicity, 9, which I'll scroll to the next one, disproportionate representation, and 10, disproportionate representation by disability categories, 11, child find, 12, early childhood transition, and then 13, which is post-secondary transition. So again, those are set by OSEP. and the rest of those were set by the group of educational partners that was convened by CDE over the previous years as well.
I would just like to note that at about 1 o'clock, our closed captioning vendors are slated to leave, so we should try to move to public comment soon.
All right, so the last slide here in terms of just the targets. Again, those are in your packet and we reviewed those last time. So again, in terms of how will CDE get to improved outcomes for students, and really thinking about LRE as a foundation of our theory of action, right? In terms of, what are sort of critical factors in improving those outcomes? One, it constitutes the right placement, as I mentioned before. In that placement, the right supports and services, and in that placement, not only are there the right supports and services, but those are being delivered in a high quality manner. And in theory, obviously, a reduction in behavior should be occurring in classrooms, and increased learning through achievement through multiple measures is our goal. And obviously, graduation and post-school achievement is our end game to ensure, again, that the outcomes for our students in terms of facing life is one in which there are choices for a student, and there's also a clear pathway ahead for them as well. In terms of how, and again, this slide was in the last presentation, monitoring and support for students with disabilities. Our approach here, again, as you see on the triangle and inverted triangle, how many LEAs are in our intensive, targeted, and universal tiers, which we annually designate LEAs each January into those tiers, and then obviously the related support that they receive either from the CDE or from our TA partners out in the field as well. In terms of our focus on least restrictive environment here, again, LEA selected for intensive monitoring, are ones that are in the lowest decile in providing a free, appropriate public education in a least restrictive environment. We'll be focusing on LRE and FAPE for all monitoring activities, with an emphasis on ensuring the most inclusive placements possible, and TA will be focused as well. Turning to early childhood and also realizing that inclusion and inclusive environments in early childhood is critical, as we know that a strong start for our students is key in inclusive settings. And so just wanted to highlight some of the funding, the $260 million in early intervention special education funding, designed to support early intervention services, wraparound services, and expansion of inclusive practices. The California State Preschool Program, again, the budget provided $130 million for expansion, which is, again, huge for our students, especially for our students with disabilities, and then the expansion of universal TK, in the sense that the phase-in will include, obviously, all 4-year-old children, and including students with disabilities. And so looking forward to the ramp up and planning around that as well. In terms of current special education investments, Mary went over these, and so I'm not going to recap all of them, but again, wanted to note that there is an additional $450 million in special education learning recovery, so that critical supports and services can be provided, additional critical supports and services can be provided to students, especially to address the impacts of COVID-19. $100 million in alternative dispute resolution, so that issues regarding the IEP or IEP process or supports and services can be addressed in a manner that allows all parties to come to an agreement at the table. And then again, the $20 million increase, it should be 15, in supporting inclusive practices as well. So with that, I will conclude, and we are requesting that the proposed targets for the performance indicators for the next 6-year cycle of the state performance plan, covering years 2021 through 25-26, be considered by the SBE for approval. And again, we're recommending approval of those targets as well.
Thank you so much. It's really helpful to get such an overview of what we need to do to get there, so that the targets are, more than numbers on the page. We want to move to public comment, and we have the public comment slide up. And those who wish to provide such comment may do so by calling the telephone number and using the access code provided on the slide that is shown now. And while we're waiting for members of the public to call in, I want to ask Vice President Strauss if she has any initial comments, and then we'll take any clarifying comments if there are any before we take public comment.
Thank you, President Darling-Hammond. I want to thank you, Heather and Mary, for presenting really a good focus on, we know this is a federal requirement that we have to complete for every 6 years, but I think your highlight in the presentation was it's really a guidance, it's guiding our process to continue to improve support and services for students with disabilities to increase their opportunities for achievement. And I think I appreciated some highlights, and I just want to reinforce that before we hear from our public comments. We've been hearing this at the Special Ed Advisory Group, but the IEP template group that came out of this process is very exciting to hear about as we improve the process. The governance and accountability study, very helpful. Those of us who've worked with special ed in local school districts recognize the challenges. And I think from the special ed task force that happened several years ago, lots of implications around credentialing, funding, template will improve the program overall. And for those of us who were trained before the common trunk of training for teachers with credentials, it was a very siloed program. And I really appreciate, Mary, you highlighting the efforts that CTC has worked on, try to give all teachers a common trunk of preparation, because we are moving toward all teachers doing first level intervention in MTSS, which you highlighted, which is a transition that districts are embracing. And I appreciate the focus on teacher preparation. Again, it's a challenge that districts continue to work on. And I think the teacher preparation program will assist that as well. So I appreciate you highlighting that. Also, the link to the system of support, because districts have identified the students with disabilities as a lower performing subgroup that they want to focus on. And a lot of MTSS work is focused on that. Also, the early learning work, which we've been talking about at our board meetings, and the work, huge investments in our state budget for teacher recruitment and support and early learning and system of support and educator professional trainings. It just is so exciting to see all this investment and the coordination. And I just want to kind of close my comments by saying that this requirement to complete this process really is guiding our work toward improvement. It is helpful to the process. And while it's very comprehensive, and I appreciate the two presentations, Heather, from the last board meeting and this one, I think for all of us to realize what an important effort it is to try to change a system as we're working in it to improve teacher abilities to deliver support, how districts view this, and the least restrictive environment. So again, I appreciate it. I think that we've come a long way. We have a lot of work ahead. So we have a lot of funding and programs, but we have to continue on the road ahead. So I thank you very much. When we're ready, I'll be ready to make a recommendation to support. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me ask, I don't see any clarifying questions to be answered. So I want to see if we have any public commenters.
We do not have public comment.
All right, terrific. And so I think we're ready for any board discussion on this item. And I will just start us off on that by sort of adding on to Vice President Strauss's comments. And to note that in that theory of action, which if you would put the theory of action back up, like that little graphic, I'm so glad that we're looking at all of these pieces, because to get the right instruction in the right placement, we have to solve the teacher supply and credentialing problems that have really led us to this much more siloed approach in the past. And I want to ask, just quickly ask both Heather and Mary, as you look at what is being put together, where we're heading, what we need to have in place to accomplish the targets, because we can set the targets, but we actually want to reach them. Are there particular things that you want us to be aware of as needed beyond what's already in motion to help us get there?
I'll go ahead and go. I think in terms of, really bringing this work to life, as you've mentioned, requires, first and foremost, a recognition that the system is operated by individuals. And I think really ensuring that, our individuals are not only equipped, but also, we are able to hold and have deep conversations about students with disabilities, hold deep conversations around philosophy and mindset towards supporting students with disabilities and their families and their communities, and really, an honest conversation about just looking at our system as a whole, from essentially start to finish, and really carving out time, I think, to have some of those deeper conversations. I think, Eileen mentioned the fact that we are essentially oftentimes doing the work and making refinements as we go, but also I think stepping back often to really look at our system and its effectiveness and really support and surface issues that are bubbling up on sort of the human side of the work, as that is often I think a critical factor in addition to getting to some of these targets in the systems that we have before us as well.
Thank you. And this is sort of part of that process that we need to keep coming around on. Mary, anything to add?
Just to underscore that we have programs in place. We need to increase the numbers of people coming through them. We need to build program capacity to prepare the workforce that we need. And that, that is maybe an easier problem to get our arms around than really intervening around attrition. Because that's very local, and but I think there's a significant issue that we need to attend to, which is how we retain the teachers that we do bring into teaching. Those are big issues.
Undoubtedly, as we've heard from other presentations, workload questions associated with that, as well as training and mentoring questions. So
absolutely,
thank you. Any other board discussion before we get to a motion? Member Rodriguez.
Yes, I just want to thank both Heather and Mary for that fantastic presentation and for starting out, with such the dire, and it is a dire need for our teacher shortage, but ending on such a positive note with the students in Long Beach and UCSB. And, it just, I could imagine that room, and I'm excited that there are incoming teachers who are so excited about working in special ed, and teachers who are coming in who have that preparation, even though they're generalists. So thank you so much.
Terrific. Seeing no other commentary, can I get a motion?
Oh, I'll move approval of this item.
Thank you. Second?
I will second it.
Thank you very much. Any further discussion? All right, Brooks, will you call the roll call vote?
Member Banaka.
Aye.
Member Burr.
Aye.
President Darlene Hammond.
Aye.
Member Escobedo.
Yes.
Member Glover Woods.
Yes.
Member McQuillan.
Yes.
Member Patillo Brownson.
Yes.
Member Rodriguez.
Yes.
Member Rucker.
Yes.
Vice President Strauss.
Yes.
Member Sun.
Aye.
Passes unanimously.
Thank you. Much appreciated. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Heather. Thank you, all board members. We are done with our agenda, and I hereby adjourn our November 2021 State Board of Education meeting at 12:53 p.m. See you in January.